You wake up on December the 19th, 1777, and your feet are already bleeding. The Continental Army is about to march into what will become the most infamous winter encampment in American history, and spoiler alert, you probably won't survive it. Hi guys, tonight we're stepping into the frozen footsteps of George Washington's army as they trudge toward Valley Forge. Tonight, you're a Continental soldier stumbling into Valley Forge, and you're probably not going to survive. This is the story of 12,000 men who endured 6 months that tested the limits of human endurance. It's brutal, it's darkly funny, and it's all true. Let's walk together into America's most infamous winter. Before you settle in, if you love these sleepy history journeys, hit like and subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Dim the lights, lean back, and let the hush of Valley Forge draw you into the greatest test of endurance America has ever seen. Your breath creates small clouds in the bitter Pennsylvania air as you shoulder your musket and fall into formation. The weapon feels heavier today, like grief made of wood and metal. Around you, 12,000 other Continental soldiers shuffle through the December mud, their faces carrying the weight of defeat after defeat. You've just lost Philadelphia to the British, and now you're retreating to, well, no one's quite sure what you're retreating to. But first, let me paint you the picture of what defeat tastes like in 1777. It tastes like the stale hardtack crumbs in your mouth, mixed with the metallic tang of blood from your cracked lips. The autumn campaign has been a disaster of epic proportions. Brandywine, Paoli, Germantown. Each battle name hits your ears like a funeral bell. You probably can't even pronounce Germantown correctly through your chattering teeth, but you remember the chaos of musket smoke and screaming horses. Here's a historical fact that'll keep you awake at night. Washington had 19th of 415 soldiers in November. By March, he'll have 7,016 fit for duty. That means roughly 12,000 men will either desert, die, or become too sick to fight. The math is simple and brutal, like trying to calculate your odds in a zombie apocalypse, except the zombie is hypothermia, and the apocalypse is revolutionary politics. You adjust your torn Continental uniform, and by uniform I mean the random collection of civilian clothes you've scrounged together that vaguely resembles military attire. Your jacket has more holes than a conspiracy theory, and your shoes, well, calling them shoes is generous. They're more like foot suggestions at this point. The sole of your left shoe flaps with each step, creating a wet, slapping sound that reminds you of raw meat hitting a butcher's block. The countryside around you looks deceptively peaceful. Rolling Pennsylvania hills stretch in every direction, covered in that particular shade of brown that happens when autumn decides to give up and let winter take over early. Bare trees reach toward the grey sky like skeletal fingers, and the only sound is the rhythmic squelch of thousands of feet trudging through half-frozen mud. But here's what your colonial Instagram wouldn't show: the smell. 12,000 unwashed men, many suffering from dysentery, marching in close formation creates an olfactory experience that would make a medieval plague pit seem fragrant. It's like someone mixed wet dog, rotting vegetables, and despair into a cologne and then sprayed it directly into your nostrils. A militiaman next to you stumbles and you catch his arm. His skin feels cold through the thin fabric of his sleeve, and you realise with growing unease that he's not shivering. That's not good. When your body stops shivering in December, usually means it's given up on the whole staying alive project. He mumbles something about his wife in Connecticut, but his words slur together like he's speaking through maple syrup. You wonder what General Washington is thinking as he rides past on his horse. The man looks tired in a way that goes deeper than physical exhaustion. It's the kind of tired that settles into your bones when you realise that the fate of a barely formed nation rested on your ability to keep a starving, freezing army together through sheer force of will. It's like being the world's most stressful group project leader, except instead of a bad grade, failure means the end of American independence. The general's horse leaves hoofprints in the mud that fill quickly with brown water. You step in one of them and feel the cold slush seep through the holes in your shoes, adding to the growing dampness in your stockings. Your toes are already numb, and it's not even the worst part of winter yet. Somewhere ahead, An officer shouts orders that get lost in the wind and the general misery of 12,000 people trying to move in the same direction without adequate food, clothing or hope. The Continental Army looks less like a fighting force and more like the world's most depressing parade. But you keep walking, because what else can you do? Desert? Sure, thousands will, but right now, in this moment, you're still here. Still putting one bleeding foot in front of the other toward a place called Valley Forge that nobody's ever heard of, but everyone will remember. You've been walking for what feels like hours when someone finally tells you where you're going. Valley Forge. The name sounds peaceful, doesn't it? Like a place where you might go for a relaxing weekend retreat, maybe do some light blacksmithing and enjoy the rustic charm of colonial Pennsylvania. You couldn't be more wrong. Valley Forge sits about 18 miles northwest of Philadelphia, which means it's close enough for the British to raid if they get bored of their comfortable city quarters, but far enough away that you can't exactly pop back for supplies or a decent meal. It's like choosing to camp in your neighbour's backyard while they're having a house party, close enough to hear the fun, far enough away to freeze in isolation. The landscape you're trudging through looks like Mother Nature decided to practice her depression. Rolling hills stretch endlessly, broken by creeks that will soon freeze solid and forests that offer about as much shelter as a political promise. The Schuylkill River winds through the area like a cold, wet serpent, and in a few weeks you'll learn to hate the sound of running water because it'll remind you of everything you can't have: warmth, comfort, civilization. Here's a fun historical fact. Valley Forge was chosen partly because it had a decent supply depot. Had being the key word. The British raided it in September, so congratulations, you're marching toward the ghost of logistics. It's like showing up to a restaurant after they've already sold out of everything except the dinner rolls. Except the dinner rolls are frozen solid and possibly mouldy. Your breath creates small clouds as you march, and you notice other soldiers doing something strange. They're saving their breath clouds, trying to warm their hands in the brief puffs of steam. It doesn't work, obviously, but it's the kind of desperate optimism that'll keep you alive for the next few weeks. Or it's the kind of desperate optimism that'll make your death slightly more comfortable. The terrain is starting to change as you approach your destination. The hills become more pronounced, and you can see why Washington picked this spot. High ground means defensible ground, which is important when the most powerful military in the world is camping just 18 miles away and probably thinking about coming over to finish what they started. Mount Joy and Mount Misery rise on either side of the valley, and whoever named them clearly had a sense of irony that would have made them great at writing Fortune 500 company mottos. Listen to the crunch of frost-covered grass beneath thousands of feet. It sounds like civilization being slowly ground into dust, which is more accurate than you might think. Each step takes you further from the world of warm houses and regular meals, and closer to a place where the basic act of staying alive becomes a full-time job. But here's where it gets interesting. You're not walking into this alone. Look around you. 12,000 men, plus about 400 women and children who followed the army because they literally have nowhere else to go. It's like the world's most desperate migration. Except, instead of seeking the promised land, you're seeking the promised land of maybe we won't all die before spring. The women and children present their own heartbreaking mathematics. Many are wives of soldiers who couldn't bear to stay home, not knowing if their husbands would ever return. Others are civilians fleeing British-occupied territory, refugees from their own country. They walk alongside the soldiers, carrying what belongings they could salvage, their faces set in expressions of determined endurance that would make modern disaster survivors look like weekend camping enthusiasts. You pass a supply wagon, one of the few remaining, and see a woman walking beside it, occasionally reaching up to steady a small child bundled in blankets. The child's face is pale, almost translucent, and you realise with uncomfortable clarity that children die faster than adults in conditions like these. Their smaller bodies can't generate enough heat, can't survive as long without food. It's a truth that hits you like a punch to the stomach. This isn't just a military retreat, it's a demographic catastrophe in progress. The officers try to maintain order, but you can see the strain in their faces. These are men who signed up to fight the British, not to manage a rolling humanitarian crisis. They shout commands about maintaining formation and staying together, but their voices carry an edge of desperation. How do you keep discipline in an army that's slowly starving and freezing? As the day wears on, the temperature begins to drop. What started as merely cold to become something more sinister. The kind of cold that creeps through your clothing layer by layer, finding every gap, every thin spot, every place where your body heat tries to escape. Your fingers are becoming clumsy inside your worn gloves, and you find yourself flexing them constantly, trying to maintain feeling. The mud beneath your feet is starting to freeze in patches, creating a treacherous surface that threatens to send you sprawling with every step. Ice forms on the puddles at the roadside, and you watch other soldiers occasionally break through the thin layer, soaking their already wet feet in the process. The sound of ice cracking underfoot becomes a constant accompaniment to the march, like nature providing a funeral dirge for the Continental Army. But somehow, you keep walking, through sheer bloody-minded determination, through the stubborn refusal to die that will characterize this entire winter. You put one foot in front of the other, and follow George Washington toward a valley that will either forge you into something stronger or kill you in the attempt. The sun is setting as you finally reach Valley Forge, and sunset in December 1777 arrives with all the warmth and comfort of a funeral announcement. The valley spreads before you like nature's own practical joke, wide enough to hold 12,000 desperate people, isolated enough to ensure that when things go bad, no one's coming to help. You've made it! Congratulations! You're now officially part of what will become American mythology. Unfortunately, mythology doesn't keep you warm, and legends don't prevent hypothermia. The valley itself looks innocuous enough in the fading light. Rolling hills, scattered trees, a few farmhouses in the distance. It's the kind of landscape that might look pastoral in a painting, assuming the painter left out the part where thousands of people are about to start dying from cold and disease. The Schuylkill River winds through the area, its dark water reflecting the grey December sky, like a mirror showing the world's least encouraging future. Here's what strikes you first. The silence. Not peaceful Vaughns, the kind of silence that happens when 12,000 people are too tired, too cold, and too hungry to make unnecessary noise. It's like someone turned down the volume on human civilization and left you with just the sound of wind through bare trees and the occasional cough that carries too much phlegm for comfort. Washington rides to the front and gives the order that will haunt your dreams. Make camp. Not, let's find some nice warm buildings to sleep in, or there's a holiday inn express over that hill. Make camp. In December. In Pennsylvania. With no shelter except what you can build with your increasingly numb hands. The officers start organising the chaos, dividing the valley into sections for different regiments and brigades. You're assigned to a spot that looks identical to every other spot, a patch of frozen ground that will become home for the next 6 months, assuming you live that long. The measurement is precise. Each hut will be 14 by 16 feet, housing 12 men. That's about 18.7 square feet per person, which is smaller than most modern closets and significantly less comfortable than solitary confinement. But first, you have to build the hut. In December, when it's getting dark, with tools that are best described as enthusiastically inadequate. You're issued an axe that's seen better decades and told to go cut down trees. The handle is worn smooth by countless hands, and the blade has chips that suggest it's been used for purposes axes were never meant for. Holding this, it feels like gripping desperation made manifest. This piece of metal is literally the difference between shelter and death, and it's held together by hope and rust. The trees around Valley Forge are hardwood, oak, maple, hickory. Beautiful trees that will provide excellent building material once you've spent 6 hours trying to cut them down with inadequate tools, while your fingers slowly freeze into unusable claws. Each swing of the axe sends vibrations up your arms, and after 10 minutes, your shoulders are burning with exhaustion. After 20 minutes, you're questioning whether trees are even technically supposed to be cuttable. Listen to the sound echoing across the valley. Hundreds of axes striking wood in irregular rhythm, like some demented percussion section trying to play a song about suffering. Thunk, 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 thunk. The forest is slowly disappearing, tree by tree, as 12,000 desperate people attempt to build shelter before winter kills them all. Other soldiers are gathering smaller branches for chinking, the material that will fill the gaps between logs and theoretically keep out the wind. theoretically being the key word because in practice your hut will have more air circulation than most modern offices and significantly less insulation than a cardboard box. Night falls like a curtain made of ice and you're still trying to drag logs into position. The darkness brings a cold that seems to have personality, malicious, determined, creative in its cruelty. It finds every gap in your clothing, every place where skin meets air, every weakness in your body's defences against the growing winter. Someone lights a fire in the centre of what will become your hut. Sight, and 12 soldiers crowd around it like worshippers at a shrine to warmth. The flames dance and flicker, casting orange light on faces that are already showing the hollow-eyed look of people who've started the slow process of starving to death. You hold your hands toward the fire and feel the heat seep into your palms, a sensation so intensely pleasurable that it's almost sexual. But here's the cruel mathematics of winter survival. The fire that warms your front leaves your back exposed to the cold, and the fire that warms your back leaves your front exposed. There's no position that provides total comfort, no angle that blocks out the persistent, teeth-chattering cold that seems to come from inside your bones. A soldier across the fire from you starts coughing, deep, wet coughs that sound like his lungs are trying to escape through his throat. In the modern world, that would be a minor concern, maybe worth a trip to the pharmacy for some over-the-counter medicine. Here, it's potentially a death sentence. Respiratory infections in winter camps kill more soldiers than probably need bullets, and you're watching one take hold in real time. The first night at Valley Forge passes with the kind of miserable, grinding slowness that makes every hour feel like a week. You sleep in shifts, taking turns feeding the fire and trying not to freeze to death while the others rest. Sleep is a generous term for what you do. It's more like temporary unconsciousness interrupted by violent shivering. By morning, your group has managed to get 4 walls partially constructed and a roof that's more concept than reality. It's not shelter in any meaningful sense, but it's something. And a gesture towards civilization, a middle finger to the weather, a declaration that you're not dead yet. But winter hasn't really started. You wake up on your second morning at Valley Forge, and the first thing you notice is that you can't feel your feet. Not my feet are cold, but my feet are hypothetical concepts that might exist somewhere below my ankles. This is not an encouraging development. The ground around your half-built hut is covered in frost that crunches like broken glass when you step on it. Your breath creates clouds so thick you could practically chew them, and the morning air has that particular quality of coldness that seems to bypass your skin and attack your skeleton directly. Here's a fun historical fact that'll warm your heart. The winter of 1777 to 78 wasn't even particularly harsh by colonial standards. Average temperatures, normal snowfall. Mother Nature was basically giving you the meteorological equivalent of a gentle pat on the head, and you're still about to watch 2,000 people die from exposure and disease. It's like failing an open book test where the book is how not to die from cold. Your hut construction continues with all the efficiency of a government committee tasked with defining the colour blue. The walls are going up log by log, and each log represents about 4 hours of cutting, dragging, lifting and cursing. The gaps between logs are supposed to be filled with chinking, a mixture of mud, clay and whatever organic matter you can find, but the chinking keeps freezing before you can apply it properly. The construction process is a masterclass in colonial-era problem-solving, which is to say it's mostly trial and error, with emphasis on the error part. You don't have proper tools, adequate materials, or any real experience building log cabins in winter conditions. What you have is desperation and the growing certainty that shelter is the difference between being a patriot and being a patriot-flavoured popsicle. But wait, there's more suffering to explore. The roof represents a special kind of architectural challenge when you're working with frozen logs, no nails, and tools that predate the concept of precision. Your roof will be a combination of branches, mud, and what the officers optimistically call thatch, but which looks suspiciously like whatever we could find lying around that isn't completely frozen solid. Listen to the sound of your fellow soldiers working around the valley, the scrape of axes against wood, the crack of branches being broken to size, the occasional colourful profanity when someone drops a log on their foot. It's like a symphony of controlled desperation, with occasional movements in the key of, "Why did I ever leave my farm to fight for independence?" The hut next to yours is being built by soldiers from Massachusetts who've brought a certain New England pragmatism to the process. They're methodically laying logs, measuring gaps, working with the kind of steady efficiency that suggests they might actually finish before spring. You hate them a little bit. Not because they're doing anything wrong, but because their competence makes your own fumbling efforts look like interpretive dance. Your own hut building team consists of 12 men from various states who have never worked together before and have different ideas about how to construct a building. The Virginian wants to build it like a tobacco barn. The New Yorker insists on following some building technique he learned from a Dutch carpenter, and the man from North Carolina just keeps muttering about how they do things differently back home. It's like trying to assemble IKEA furniture where there's a committee that speaks different dialects and has never seen the instruction manual. The logs themselves present their own challenges. Greenwood is heavy and doesn't fit together, neatly. Seasoned wood is lighter, but cracks in unpredictable ways. Every piece of timber seems designed by nature to be slightly the wrong size for whatever you're trying to do with it. You spend an hour trimming a log to fit, only to discover that now it's too short for the space you were trying to fill. By midday, your hands are so cold that gripping the axe becomes a feat of willpower. Your fingers feel like they belong to someone else, someone who's maybe been dead for a few hours and whose nervous system is operating on backup power. The axe handle slips in your grasp, and you nearly take off your own foot, which would be a stupid way to die but not uncommon in winter camps. Here's a fringe fact that would fascinate historians. More Continental soldiers were injured by their own tools than by British weapons during the Valley Forge winter. Frostbitten fingers can't grip properly. Exhausted minds make poor decisions, and when you combine sharp tools with desperate people, accidents happen. The camp surgeon spends more time treating axe wounds than battle injuries. The afternoon brings a new challenge. The temperature starts dropping as the sun begins its early winter descent. What little warmth the day provided evaporates like hope in Congress, and the logs you've been working with all day start to freeze together in whatever position you left them. If you made a mistake in placement, too bad. That log is now a permanent fixture until spring. Evening arrives with the enthusiasm of a tax collector, and you survey your day's work. 3 walls are mostly complete, the 4th wall has a gap large enough for a person to walk through, and the roof exists primarily as a philosophical concept. It's shelter in the same way that standing under a tree during a hurricane is shelter. Technically accurate, but practically useless. But it's yours. This ramshackle collection of frozen logs and frozen mud represents your home for the next 6 months. It's not much, but it's what stands between you and becoming a historical footnote about the soldiers who froze to death in the cause of liberty. The fire in the centre of your hut site provides the only warm spot in an increasingly cold world. 12 men cluster around it, sharing not just heat but the growing realization that they're completely dependent on each other for survival. The man next to you shares his last piece of hardtack, not out of generosity, but out of the practical understanding that keeping your hutmates alive keeps you alive. As you settle in for another night of intermittent sleep and constant shivering, you can hear similar scenes playing out across the valley. Thousands of fires, thousands of half-built shelters, thousands of people trying to survive one more night in the hope that tomorrow will somehow be better. It won't be. You wake up on day 3 at Valley Forge, and your stomach is making noises that sound like a dying animal attempting to communicate through. Interpretive growling. Hunger has moved past the point of being annoying and entered the realm of actual physical pain. A constant gnawing ache that makes concentration nearly impossible. Your breakfast consists of what the army optimistically calls fire cake, which is flour mixed with water and baked on a hot stone. It tastes like disappointment with a texture somewhere between cardboard and regret. The Revolutionary War version of fast food, except instead of being fast, it's slow. And instead of being food, though it's barely edible paste that keeps you alive just long enough to suffer more. Here's a cheerful historical fact. The Continental Army's daily ration was supposed to include 1 pound of meat, 1 pound of bread, and various other provisions that sound almost luxurious from your current perspective. What you actually get is whatever the Commissary department could scrounge up, which on most days is nothing approaching adequate nutrition. It's like ordering a 5-course meal and receiving a cracker and an apology. The work on your hut continues with the added challenge of malnutrition. Your hands shake as you grip the axe, not just from cold but from the body's growing desperation for calories. Every swing requires conscious effort, and what should be simple tasks become exercises in stubborn determination. Lifting a log that would have been manageable a week ago now requires 3 men, and a considerable amount of creative profanity. But here's where the situation gets truly medieval. You're not just building one hut, you're part of a construction project that will eventually encompass roughly 1/500 log structures spread across the valley. It's like building a small city, except the city is being built by starving people with inadequate tools in the middle of winter, and the penalty for poor construction is death. The valley has become a maze of partially constructed buildings, piles of logs, and work sites that look like architectural crime scene in Hammer. Smoke rises from hundreds of small fires, creating a hazy atmosphere that makes the whole place look like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Which in a way it is. A disaster created by the collision of military necessity and winter weather. Other soldiers move through the construction zones like zombies with purpose, their faces gaunt and their movements deliberate but slow. Everyone's conserving energy because energy is now a precious resource that must be rationed as carefully as food. Unnecessary movement is a luxury none of you can afford. Listen to the sounds of Valley Forge taking shape, axes striking wood, but slower and less frequently than before. Men calling for help moving logs, their voices hoarse from cold and exhaustion. The occasional crash as a wall section collapses because frozen hands couldn't maintain their grip. It's progress, but progress measured in inches while winter advances in miles. The organisational structure of the camp is starting to emerge. Streets are laid out between rows of huts, creating what will eventually look like a military city. Officers' quarters are being built on slightly higher ground, not much higher, but enough to provide better drainage and a psychological sense of authority. The hospital sites are marked but not yet constructed, which seems optimistic given the number of people who are already showing signs of serious illness. Your own hut has reached the point where you can technically call it a structure, though death trap might be more accurate. The roof leaks in 17 different places, the walls have gaps you could throw a cat through, and the door is a blanket hung over an opening. But it's yours, and after 4 days of sleeping essentially outdoors, even this inadequate shelter feels like luxury. The 12 men who share your hut have developed a system for managing the fire that burns constantly in the centre of the dirt floor. Someone is always on fire duty, feeding branches and logs to keep the flames alive, because letting the fire die is literally a death sentence. The fire is the difference between uncomfortably cold and fatally cold, between illness and dying of exposure. But maintaining the fire requires fuel, and fuel requires wood, and wood requires cutting, and cutting requires energy you don't have. It's a mathematical problem with no good solution. You need calories to cut wood to burn to stay warm enough to avoid using extra calories fighting hypothermia. The numbers don't add up, which means something has to give, and that something is usually your body weight. Here's a fringe fact that would horrify modern nutritionists. The average Continental soldier at Valley Forge was consuming perhaps 200 calories per day while performing physical labour that required 3,000 calories. Your body is essentially cannibalizing itself to provide the energy for basic survival. You're burning muscle mass to fuel the work of building shelter, which reduces your capacity for future work, which makes tomorrow's survival more difficult than today's. The psychological impact of constant hunger is as debilitating as the physical effects. Food becomes an obsession, dominating your thoughts in a way that makes concentration nearly impossible. Conversations revolve around memories of meals, speculation about when supplies might arrive, and elaborate fantasies about what you'll eat when this is over. It's like being trapped in an endless episode of a cooking show where you can see the food but never taste it. Evening comes early in December, and with it the daily ritual of trying to sleep while slowly freezing. Your hut now provides some protection from wind, but warmth is still a temporary condition that exists only in the immediate vicinity of the fire. Sleep comes in brief intervals between feeding the fire and dealing with the cold that seeps through every gap in your inadequate clothing. The night brings sounds that will haunt your dreams. Soldiers coughing in nearby huts, the crack of settling logs, the occasional cry of someone having a nightmare about food or warmth or home. It's the soundtrack of an army slowly consuming itself in the service of an idea that seems increasingly abstract when measured against the immediate reality of survival. But you're still alive, still building, still fighting the daily battle against hunger, cold and despair. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new shortages, new reasons to question whether independence is worth this price. But tonight, huddled around a fire with 11 other men who smell as bad as you do, you're still part of something larger than yourself, even if that something is slowly killing you. You wake up on your 5th morning at Valley Forge, and the first thing you notice is that the soldier next to you isn't breathing. Not the slow, steady breathing of sleep, but the absolute stillness that means his personal war for independence ended sometime during the night. His name was Jonathan. He was from Connecticut, and he's the first person you've watched die from the simple act of being too cold and too hungry for too long. This is how winter kills in 1777. Not dramatically, not with fanfare or final speeches, but quietly sealing a life 1 degree at a time, until the body simply stops trying to maintain the impossible mathematics of survival. Here's a sobering historical fact. Valley Forge wasn't even the deadliest winter encampment of the Revolutionary War. That honour goes to Morristown in 1779-80, which makes this current suffering feel like a dress rehearsal for something even worse. It's like discovering that your current experience of hell is actually just the opening act for a more elaborate torment. The death changes everything and nothing. Officers come to collect Jonathan's body. He'll be buried in one of the growing cemeteries that dot the hills around Valley Forge. And within an hour, another soldier has claimed his space by the fire. The living can't afford sentiment when survival depends on access to warmth. You'll mourn him later, if you live long enough for later to matter. But the mathematical reality of the situation is becoming impossible to ignore. 12,000 soldiers arrived in December. By some estimates, as many as 2,000 will die before spring, not from British bullets, but from the combination of malnutrition, exposure and disease that winter camps breed like a laboratory for human suffering. That's 1 in 6. Russian roulette odds, except the game lasts for months instead of seconds. Your hut is now technically complete, which means it has 4 walls, a roof and enough gaps to ensure excellent ventilation for anyone who enjoys breathing freezing air while trying to sleep. The door is still a blanket, the windows are gaps in the walls, and the insulation is primarily theoretical. But it's shelter, and shelter is the difference between dying quickly and dying slowly. The daily routine has settled into a grim pattern. Wake up, determine who has survived the night, feed the fire, eat whatever pathetic excuse for breakfast the commissary has provided, work on whatever construction project needs attention, eat whatever pathetic excuse for dinner exists, try to sleep without freezing to death, repeat. It's like Groundhog Day. If Groundhog Day was directed by someone with a sadistic sense of humour and a budget consisting entirely of suffering. Other huts in your area are in various stages of completion, creating a landscape that looks like a construction site abandoned by people who had somewhere better to be. Some structures are nearly finished, with proper doors and chimneys that actually draw smoke upward instead of filling the interior with choking fumes. Others are barely more than piles of logs arranged with optimistic intent. The inequality of construction skills is becoming a life and death matter. Soldiers with carpentry experience or natural building ability are living in relatively comfortable shelters, while those who've never built anything more complex than a campfire are dying in inadequate hovels. It's a harsh lesson in how previous life experience can determine survival in extreme circumstances. Listen to the sounds of Valley Forge in late December. Less hammering and chopping now, more coughing, and the soft sounds of people conserving energy. The initial burst of construction activity has given way to the long grind of maintenance, keeping fires burning, repairing roofs that collapse under snow, chinking gaps that open as greenwood dries and shrinks. The cold has settled into the valley like a permanent resident with no intention of leaving. It's not just the temperature, though that's bad enough, but the way the cold seems to have personality. It finds every weakness in your clothing, every gap in your shelter, every moment when your guard is down. Fighting it requires constant vigilance, and vigilance requires energy you don't have. Your clothing situation has moved beyond merely inadequate into the realm of creative desperation. Your original Continental uniform, assuming you ever had one, has been patched, repatched, and supplemented with whatever fabric you could acquire through trade, theft, or the personal effects of soldiers who no longer needed clothes. You're wearing the fashion equivalent of a ransom note, assembled from mismatched pieces that collectively form something resembling warmth. But here's where the human spirit shows its stubborn refusal to surrender. You're adapting, learning to sleep in positions that conserve heat, sharing body warmth without embarrassment, developing an almost supernatural ability to detect which direction the wind is coming from and how to minimize its impact. You're becoming an expert in survival skills you never wanted to learn. The camp is developing its own economy based on bartering scarce resources. A needle for sewing becomes worth several days' rations. A pair of shoes without holes commands the price of a musket. Information about where to find firewood or which officers might have extra food becomes currency more valuable than Continental script, which admittedly isn't saying much. Women in the camp face their own specialised set of challenges. They're doing much of the cooking, washing and nursing, while dealing with the same food shortages and exposure as the men. Many are pregnant or caring for small children, adding layers of complexity to survival that make the soldiers' problems seem straightforward by comparison. A woman trying to keep a baby alive in these conditions is engaged in a form of warfare that requires different but equally desperate strategies. As evening approaches, you huddle around the fire with your remaining hutmates and engage in the nightly ritual of calculating tomorrow's survival odds. Who has the worst cough? Whose feet show signs of frostbite? Who's losing weight fastest? It's a morbid actuarial exercise, but knowledge is power, and power is the ability to make it through one more night. The fire burns lower as you settle in for another night of intermittent sleep and constant cold. Outside you can hear the sounds of other soldiers dealing with their own survival challenges. Someone splitting wood, someone coughing up what sounds like pieces of their lungs, someone crying quietly for reasons that don't require explanation. But you're still here, still breathing, still fighting the daily battle against entropy and winter, and there's growing certainty that George Washington's grand experiment in self-governance might end right here in this frozen valley, not with a bang but with a whimper of slowly dying soldiers. You wake up on a January morning that feels like the temperature was set by someone who genuinely hates humanity, and you realise you haven't had what could reasonably be called a meal in 4 days. Your stomach has given up growling and moved on to what can only be described as philosophical commentary, long, contemplative sounds that seem to question the fundamental nature of existence. Breakfast today consists of what the army optimistically calls water soup, which is hot water with occasional rumours of vegetables that might have been in the pot at some point in the theoretical past. It tastes like disappointment seasoned with false hope, and it's the closest thing to nutrition you'll see until evening, assuming evening brings anything resembling food. Here's a delightful historical fact that'll really brighten your day. The Continental Congress has basically stopped funding the army. Not officially, of course, they are still passing resolutions and making promises, but the actual business of providing food, clothing and supplies has become someone else's problem. It's like your parents telling you they support your college education while secretly cancelling your meal plan and not mentioning it. The Commissary department, which is supposed to keep you fed, has devolved into an exercise in creative failure. On paper, you're entitled to daily rations that would actually sustain human life. In reality, the Commissary operates on the principle that food is more of a suggestion than a requirement, and that soldiers can survive on patriotism and the occasional crumb of mouldy bread. But let's explore the fascinating world of Revolutionary War logistics, shall we? Your food is supposed to come from local farmers who sell to government purchasing agents who transport it to the army via a system of wagons, boats, and sheer optimism. What actually happens is that farmers prefer to sell to the British because they pay in real currency instead of continental script, which is worth slightly less than used napkins and considerably less reliable than promises from politicians. The purchasing agents, when they exist and when they're not pocketing the money for their own use, compete with each other for the same limited supplies. Pennsylvania sends agents, Congress sends agents, and the army sends agents, and they all bid against each other for food that was already inadequate to begin with. It's like having 3 different parts of your body fighting over the same sandwich while you slowly starve to death. Meanwhile, transportation presents its own special challenges. Wagons break down on winter roads, teamsters desert when they realise they're not getting paid, and horses die from the same malnutrition that's killing the soldiers. The logical supply chain has become an illogical series of accidents connected by frozen mud and broken promises. Your personal hunger has evolved through several distinct phases. First was simple appetite, the normal desire for food that you'd have felt before meals your entire life. Then came actual hunger, the gnawing, demanding sensation that made concentration difficult. That was followed by what you now recognise as the early stages of starvation, weakness, dizziness, and the strange mental clarity that comes when your body starts cannibalizing itself for fuel. Now you're entering a phase that's almost surreal. Hunger so constant and overwhelming that it becomes a separate entity, a companion that never leaves your side. You find yourself having conversations with your stomach, negotiating with your appetite, making deals with the growing emptiness that seems to be replacing your internal organs one by one. Listen to the sounds of a starving army, the constant gurgling of empty stomachs, the wet coughs of men whose bodies are breaking down from malnutrition, the shuffling footsteps of soldiers who no longer have the energy for proper marching. It's like a symphony composed by someone who understands that suffering has its own musical structure. The psychological effects of starvation are as debilitating as the physical ones. Food becomes the primary topic of conversation, the subject of elaborate fantasies, the focus of dreams that are so vivid you wake up, expecting to taste the imaginary meals you've been consuming. Soldiers spend hours describing meals they ate months ago in detail that would make food critics jealous. But here's where human ingenuity meets desperate circumstances. You're learning to find nutrition in places you never would have considered edible. Tree bark, when properly prepared, can provide some sustenance. Certain roots, if you can dig them out of the frozen ground, contain enough calories to keep you functional for another day. Boot leather, boiled long enough, becomes something approaching soup. The camp followers, the women and children who've attached themselves to the army, face their own unique challenges in finding food. Many have become expert foragers, venturing into the surrounding countryside to gather anything that might be edible. They trade services for scraps, work as laundresses and seamstresses, in exchange for whatever food the soldiers can spare, and perform small miracles of cooking that turn inedible ingredients into something approaching nourishment. Some entrepreneurial souls have established what could generously be called restaurants, canvas-covered areas where, for the right price, you might be able to purchase food that's marginally better than what the Commissary provides. The prices are astronomical. A piece of bread costs more than a day's wages. But for soldiers who still have anything to barter, it's a reminder that food still exists somewhere in the world. The officers, of course, eat better than the enlisted men, and though better is a relative term when measured against the standard of barely surviving. They have access to their own purchasing networks, can afford to pay premium prices for scarce supplies, and benefit from the social connections that come with rank. But even officers are losing weight. Even colonels are learning the names of plants they never thought they'd consider edible. Your own weight loss has progressed to the point where your Continental uniform, assuming the collection of rags you're wearing can still be called a uniform, hangs on your frame like clothing designed for a much larger person. Your belt has been tightened to the last possible notch, and you're considering making new holes with your bayonet. As evening approaches, you join the daily ritual of hoping that someone, somewhere, has discovered a source of food that can be shared among the masses of slowly starving soldiers. Sometimes these hopes are rewarded with a handful of flour that can be mixed with water and baked into something technically edible. Sometimes they're rewarded with nothing but the opportunity to hope again tomorrow. The fire in your hut burns lower as you settle in for another night of dreams about food and sleep interrupted by hunger pangs that feel like your stomach is trying to eat itself from the inside out. Outside you can hear similar scenes playing out across the valley. Thousands of people going to bed hungry, wondering if tomorrow will bring sustenance or just another day of creative starvation. But you're still here, still breathing, still fighting the daily battle against a logistics system that seems designed by people who've never heard of food, and implemented by people who've forgotten that armies need to eat to function. You wake up in mid-February to discover that General Washington has apparently decided that if the Continental Congress won't feed his army, he'll just have to take matters into his own hands. The solution is called the Grand Forage, which sounds like an elegant military maneuver, but is basically organised theft with patriotic justification. Here's how it works. 1,500 soldiers, including possibly you, will sweep through Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware and western New Jersey, collecting food, supplies and anything else that might keep the army alive through the remaining winter months. It's as like Black Friday shopping, except instead of fighting over discounted electronics, you're fighting the weather for the right to confiscate grain from farmers who probably need it as much as you do. The orders come down through the chain of command with the kind of careful wording that makes lawyers proud and historians suspicious. You're not saddling. You're impressing supplies for the Continental Army. You're not robbing civilians. You're requisitioning necessary provisions for the defence of liberty. The semantic distinction probably matters to someone, though it's unclear whether that someone is the farmer watching you load his grain into army wagons, or the soldier trying to justify taking food from people who are also struggling to survive. Nathaniel Greene leads this expedition, which gives it an air of legitimacy that might be lacking if it were led by someone with less impressive military credentials. Greene is competent, respected, and deeply unhappy about having to organise what amounts to a foraging operation across 4 colonies while British forces lurk nearby, ready to interfere with your already dubious supply-gathering activities. But here's the fascinating moral complexity of the situation. You're stealing food from American farmers to feed American soldiers fighting for American independence. It's like robbing Peter to pay Paul, except Peter and Paul are the same person and the currency is survival and the bank is a frozen valley where people are dying from hunger. The revolutionary ethics get complicated when revolution requires taking resources from the people you're supposedly defending. Your foraging party moves out from Valley Forge with all the enthusiasm of people who've been promised the possibility of actual food if they were willing to walk dozens of miles in winter weather and engage in legally questionable procurement activities. The promise of filling your stomach provides motivation that patriotic speeches never quite manage to achieve. The countryside you're foraging through looks like winter's own version of economic devastation. Farms that should be prosperous are struggling with the same supply shortages and economic chaos that plague the army. Many farmers have already sold their best crops to the British, who pay in hard currency rather than continental promises. Others have hidden their stores, anticipating exactly the kind of requisitioning expedition you're participating in. Each farm presents its own negotiation challenge. Some farmers are sympathetic to the cause and willing to part with supplies, though they can't afford to give away resources their own families need for winter survival. Others are openly hostile, viewing your foraging party as bandits with official sanction. A few are genuinely enthusiastic supporters who offer more than you expected, treating you like heroes rather than desperate men engaged in legalized theft. Listen to the sounds of foraging. The creak of wagon wheels on frozen ground, the lowing of cattle being herded away from their familiar pastures, the arguments between soldiers and farmers over what constitutes fair compensation for requisitioned goods. It's commerce conducted at the point of muskets, with patriotism serving as both currency and justification. The legal framework for foraging is impressively creative. You're supposed to give receipts for everything you take, promising future payment when the Continental Congress gets its financial house in order. These receipts are worth exactly as much as continental currency, which is to say they're worth slightly more than nothing, but considerably less than something. It's like writing IOUs during a poker game where everyone knows the bank is broke, but the psychological impact of finding actual food after months of near starvation is almost overwhelming. When your foraging party discovers a hidden cache of grain or manages to negotiate for a few head of cattle, the relief is so intense it's almost spiritual. It's the difference between dying slowly and living uncomfortably, between watching your body consume itself and having enough nutrition to function as a human being rather than a slowly collapsing collection of bones and increasingly desperate determination. The foraging expedition becomes a masterclass in military logistics under impossible circumstances. Moving 500 men across winter terrain while collecting supplies, managing livestock, protecting against British interference, and maintaining some semblance of discipline requires organisational skills that would challenge modern military planners with computerised supply chains and satellite communications. Your personal role in this operation depends partly on your skills and partly on chance. If you have experience with livestock, you might find yourself herding cattle through snow while trying to keep them moving toward Valley Forge. If you're handy with wagons, you might be loading grain and trying to keep wheels functional on roads that exist more in theory than practice. If you're particularly unlucky, you might be assigned to negotiations with farmers who view your arrival as somewhere between natural disaster and foreign invasion. The weather adds its own complications to the foraging operation. February in Pennsylvania is not prime travelling weather under the best circumstances, and these are decidedly not the best circumstances. Snow, ice, and the kind of cold that makes metal tools painful to touch turn every mile into an endurance test. Wagons get stuck, animals refuse to move, and soldiers discover new and creative ways to achieve frostbite while performing necessary duties. But here's the remarkable thing, it works, sort of. The Grand Forage manages to collect enough supplies to prevent the complete collapse of the Continental Army. though it's hardly a solution to the underlying logistics problems. It's more like applying a bandage to a severed artery, helpful in the short term but not a permanent fix for the underlying issue of how to feed an army that the government can't or won't support. The expedition returns to Valley Forge loaded with supplies that seem almost miraculous after months of systematic starvation. Flour, actual meat, vegetables that haven't been frozen solid and thawed so many times they've achieved the texture of organic slush. It's like Christmas morning, if Christmas was celebrated by people who've been slowly dying from malnutrition and consider a handful of grain to be the most precious gift imaginable. As you help unload the wagons and distribute supplies, you realise you've participated in something that's simultaneously necessary and morally ambiguous, successful and deeply problematic. You've helped save the Continental Army by taking resources from the civilians the army is supposed to protect. It's the kind of ethical complexity that makes revolution a messier business than the pamphlet suggested. You're sitting by your hut's fire in late February, gnawing on a piece of salt pork that's tougher than diplomatic negotiations and about as satisfying as a politician's promise, when you realise that Valley Forge has developed its own unique economy based entirely on scarcity and creative desperation. Everything has value now, but not the kind of value that makes sense in the normal world. A needle for sewing is worth more than a silver coin because you can't mend your clothes with silver, and clothes that can't be mended are clothes that stop keeping you warm, and warmth is the difference between life and death. It's like living in a world where the currency is survival, and the exchange rate is constantly fluctuating based on how close to dying everyone feels on any given day. Here's a fun economic fact that would make Adam Smith weep. Continental currency is now worth so little that soldiers use it for kindling. Not metaphorically, literally. You can burn continental bills to start fires, and they're more useful as fuel than as money. It's the only economy in history where inflation has been solved by using the currency as a heating source. But the informal economy of Valley Forge operates on principles that would fascinate economists if economists were interested in markets where the primary commodity is not dying today. Soap, when it can be found, commands prices that would make luxury goods manufacturers jealous. A bar of soap can be traded for several days' worth of food, which makes sense when you consider that disease kills more soldiers than bullets, and disease thrives in conditions where personal hygiene is a forgotten luxury. Your own participation in this economy has evolved from desperate necessity to something approaching expertise. You've learnt that buttons are valuable because they can be traded to women who do mending in exchange for having your clothes repaired. You've discovered that information about where to find firewood is worth actual food, because firewood is the difference between a hut that provides shelter and a hut that provides frozen sleeping accommodations. The most valuable currency in the camp is services, rather than goods. If you can repair shoes, you can eat. If you can read and write letters for illiterate soldiers, you can stay warm. If you can play a musical instrument, you can earn enough goodwill to be shared into other people's meals. It's a service economy based on skills that aren't military, but are essential for maintaining morale in conditions that systematically destroy the hope. Listen to the sounds of commerce at Valley Forge. The quiet negotiations between soldiers trading personal possessions for necessities. The whispered conversations about who might have extra food to spare. The soft arguments over the relative value of a blanket versus a pair of gloves. It's capitalism reduced to its most basic elements. People trying to acquire what they need to survive by trading what they can afford to lose. Women in the camp have become the backbone of this informal economy, not because they're naturally better at commerce, but because they're often responsible for managing household-type functions that translate well to trading relationships. They wash clothes, mend uniforms, nurse the sick, and cook whatever food can be found, all while managing their own survival challenges. Many have become skilled negotiators who can squeeze value out of resources that men would simply consume without thinking about optimization. The camp followers have established what amounts to a parallel marketplace where different rules apply. They trade in gossip, which has real value when information about supply deliveries or British movements can affect survival strategies. They provide services that the army doesn't officially recognise but desperately needs. Midwifery, specialised cooking, emotional support for soldiers who are slowly breaking down under the psychological pressure of prolonged suffering. But here's where the economics get really interesting. Debt. Soldiers are accumulating debts to each other that can't be paid until after the war, assuming anyone survives to collect. You owe 3 days of firewood duty to the man who shared his last piece of bread with you when you were too weak to search for food yourself. Someone else owes you assistance with hut repairs in exchange for the loan of your axe when his broke and couldn't be replaced. These debts create a complex web of mutual obligation that functions as both economic system and social safety net. If you die, your debts die with you. But if you live, you're bound by agreements that may have saved your life during the worst parts of winter. It's credit system based on the assumption that survival creates moral obligations that transcend normal commercial relationships. The psychological impact of this economy is as important as its practical function. Having something to trade gives you agency in a situation where most factors are beyond your control. Being able to negotiate, even over small things, maintains a sense of personal dignity that's essential for psychological survival. Is the difference between being a passive victim of circumstances and being an active participant in your own fate. Officers participate in this economy, but at a different level, with access to resources that enlisted men can only dream about. They can afford to purchase supplies from the few merchants who occasionally visit the camp. They have connections that sometimes result in unexpected windfalls of food or clothing, and they can trade on their status tours to access services that common soldiers can't obtain. But even officers are feeling the pressure of economic scarcity. Many are going into the personal debt to support their soldiers, using their own credit to purchase supplies that the army can't provide. It's a form of leadership that requires financial sacrifice as well as military competence, and it's bankrupting men who thought they were volunteering for war, not for personal economic ruin. As evening approaches, you inventory your personal wealth: a bent spoon that can be used for both eating and basic repairs, a piece of string that's invaluable for dozens of purposes, a button that you're saving for a truly desperate trade, and the knowledge of where to find a particular type of edible root that most soldiers haven't discovered yet. It's not much, but it's enough to participate in the economy of survival that's keeping the Continental Army functional despite the best efforts of winter and governmental neglect. The fire burns lower as you calculate tomorrow's trading opportunities. Who might need services you can provide? What resources might become available? How can you position yourself to take advantage of the small opportunities that mean the difference between getting by and getting ahead in a world where getting ahead means having enough food to feel satisfied for one entire day? But you're still here, still participating in an economy that shouldn't work but does, still finding ways to create value out of scarcity, still proving that human ingenuity can construct functional systems even under conditions that would challenge the survival instincts of cockroaches. You wake up in early March and the soldier in the bunk next to you is making sounds that can only be described as wet death rattles with a side of apocalyptic wheezing. He's got what the camp surgeon optimistically calls camp fever, but which you recognise as the sound of someone's lungs trying to escape through their throat while their body temperature apparently attempts to achieve fusion with the sun. Disease has moved into Valley Forge like an unwelcome relative who shows up uninvited and then refuses to leave. It's taken up residence in every hut, every gathering place, every corner where more than 2 people have shared the same air for more than 5 minutes. And unlike the British, who have the courtesy to attack from outside your defences, disease attacks from within, turning your own body into enemy territory. Here's a cheerful medical fact that'll brighten your entire week. More Continental soldiers will die from disease this winter than have died in all the battles since the war began. Typhoid, dysentery, typhus, pneumonia, and a collection of other ailments that sound like they were named by someone with a particularly dark sense of humour are systematically killing more Americans than the entire British Army has managed to eliminate through professional military action. The medical situation at Valley Forge exists somewhere between medieval and non-existent. The camp surgeon is a dedicated man with good intentions and medical knowledge that would be considered advanced for 1650. He has access to treatments that include bloodletting, purging, and the administration of mercury, which is helpful if your goal is to add mercury poisoning to whatever was already killing you. But let's explore the fascinating world of 18th century military medicine, shall we? The theory is that most diseases are caused by bad air, or an imbalance of bodily humours, which means treatment focuses on restoring balance through methods that would make modern doctors weep and modern patients file lawsuits. The good news is that some treatments accidentally work. The bad news is that nobody knows why they work, so success is more about luck than medical science. Your hut has become a case study in how disease spreads when 12 people share an 18 by 16 foot space with minimal ventilation and no understanding of germ theory. The soldier with camp fever has been coughing directly into the air that everyone else breathes, creating what modern epidemiologists would recognise as ideal conditions for respiratory disease transmission. It's like living in a biological weapons laboratory designed by someone who's trying to maximise casualties while minimising comfort. These symptoms you're observing in your sick hutmate progress with the predictable horror of a slow-motion disaster. First came the cough, dry and persistent, like his lungs were trying to communicate in Morse code. Then the fever arrived, turning his skin hot to the touch while he shivered uncontrollably. Now he's developed the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose body is fighting a war against microscopic enemies he can't see or understand. Listen to the sounds of disease at Valley Forge, constant coughing that echoes across the valley like a symphony of respiratory distress. The groans of soldiers dealing with dysentery that turns basic bodily functions into exercises in agony. The quiet conversations of people trying to comfort the dying when comfort is a luxury no one can afford. It's like nature composed a soundtrack specifically designed to accompany human misery. But here's where the situation becomes truly medieval. Sanitation. The latrines are positioned downstream from the water source, which would be fine if water actually flowed downstream consistently in winter conditions. Instead, you have a situation where human waste and drinking water occupy roughly the same geographical space, creating conditions that would make cholera bacteria send thank you notes if bacteria were capable of gratitude. Personal hygiene has moved beyond challenging into the realm of theoretical concept that exists only in memory. You haven't had what could reasonably be called a bath since arriving at Valley Forge, and most of your clothes haven't been properly washed since before Christmas. You're wearing the same shirt you've been wearing for 6 weeks, and it's achieved a level of filth that would be impressive if it weren't also potentially lethal. The lack of soap exacerbates every other health problem. Lice have established permanent residence in your hair and clothing, creating constant itching that makes sleep even more difficult than cold and hunger have already made it. The lice carry typhus, which means every time you scratch, you're potentially introducing disease into small wounds created by fingernails that are too long because you don't have proper tools for personal grooming. Your sick hutmate's condition is deteriorating with the kind of steady progression that makes medical professionals feel helpless and amateur caregivers feel completely useless. He's stopped eating, partly because food makes him nauseous, partly because swallowing has become painful, mostly because his body has apparently decided that digestion is a luxury it can no longer afford while fighting whatever infection has taken residence in his respiratory system. The other soldiers in your hut are dealing with the situation through a combination of practical concern and emotional distance. Everyone wants to help, but everyone also understands that getting too close to someone with camp fever significantly increases your chances of developing camp fever yourself. It's triage at the personal level. You provide what comfort you can, while maintaining enough distance to preserve your own survival chances. Women in the camp have become the de facto medical corps, not because they have more medical training than the men, but because they're often more skilled at providing the kind of care that actually helps, keeping patients clean, making sure they consume what liquids they can manage, providing comfort during the worst phases of illness. Many have experience caring for sick family members, and they've developed instincts about what helps and what doesn't that surpass the theoretical knowledge of formally trained physicians. The camp hospital exists, but it's more accurately described as a place where people go to die slightly more comfortably than they would in their huts. The hospital has more space, better ventilation, and access to the limited medical supplies available, but it also has a higher concentration of sick people, which increases the risk of catching additional diseases while trying to recover from your original ailment. Here's a fringe medical fact that would fascinate historians. More soldiers recover from serious illnesses in their huts than in the hospital, not because hut-based medical care is superior, but because the hospital is where the sickest people are concentrated. It's like a medical facility designed by someone who understands that proximity to other sick people is the best way to ensure you get sick with multiple diseases simultaneously. As evening approaches, your sick hutmate's breathing becomes more laboured, and you realise you're probably watching someone die from what in the modern world would be a treatable respiratory infection. It's a reminder that in 1778, your immune system is essentially your entire medical system, and if your immune system fails, there are no backup options available. The fire burns low as you and your remaining healthy hutmates discuss what to do when your sick companion dies during the night. Someone will need to report his death to the officers, someone will need to help move his body, and someone will need to clean his belongings to prevent the spread of whatever killed him. It's practical planning for a practical problem in a world where death has become a routine administrative matter. But you're still healthy, still breathing without pain, still able to think clearly, still functioning as a human being rather than a collection of symptoms waiting for resolution. Tomorrow will bring new health challenges, new exposures to disease, new opportunities for your immune system to prove whether it's strong enough to keep you alive in conditions designed to kill you. You wake up to discover that the camp's latest epidemic has a name that sounds almost pleasant until you experience it firsthand: dysentery. It's what happens when your digestive system decides to stage its own revolution against your body. Except this revolution involves significantly more cramping and considerably less noble rhetoric about freedom and independence. Your hutmate Jonathan, not the one who died, this is a different Jonathan, because apparently Valley Forge has an unlimited supply of soldiers named Jonathan who are slowly dying from various ailments, has developed what the medical personnel delicately refer to as the bloody flux. It's dysentery, but with a name that sounds like it should be followed by a dramatic musical sting and possibly some special effects. Here's a delightful medical fact that'll make you appreciate modern sanitation. Dysentery kills people through dehydration caused by uncontrollable diarrhea. Your body essentially waters itself to death while trying to flush out whatever bacterial infection has taken residence in your intestines. It's like drowning, except you're drowning from the inside out and the water is coming from your own digestive system. The progression of dysentery follows a predictable pattern that you're now observing, with the clinical detachment of someone who might be next in line for the same experience. First comes the cramping, sharp twisting pains that make the victim double over and a curse in languages that haven't been invented yet. Then the diarrhea begins, starting as merely inconvenient and progressing to life-threatening as the body loses fluids faster than they can be replaced. But here's where the situation becomes truly grim. Valley Forge doesn't have adequate facilities for dealing with mass epidemic dysentery. The latrines were designed for normal digestive functions, not for an army of people experiencing simultaneous intestinal rebellion. The result is a sanitation crisis that would challenge modern waste management systems and completely overwhelms 18th century facilities that were marginal to begin with. Your personal experience with dysentery begins with what seems like normal digestive upset. A bit of cramping after eating the usual inadequate rations, some rumbling in your lower abdomen that might be hunger, or might be your intestines preparing to declare independence from your body. You ignore it initially because you've learnt to ignore most forms of physical discomfort that aren't immediately life-threatening. The cramping intensifies over the course of the morning, progressing from mildly annoying to definitely concerning to possibly problematic. By midday, you're experiencing the kind of intestinal distress that makes concentration nearly impossible, and walking a challenge that requires careful planning and frequent stops. Your body is essentially holding you hostage to your own digestive system. Listen to the sounds of dysentery at Valley Forge, the constant traffic to and from the latrines, the groans of soldiers dealing with cramping that feels like being stabbed from the inside, the quiet conversations about who's been affected and how bad their symptoms have become. It's like a symphony composed by someone who understands that human dignity has limits, and those limits are tested by intestinal diseases. The medical treatment for dysentery consists primarily of hoping it goes away on its own, while trying to prevent death through dehydration. The camp surgeon prescribes bed rest, which is excellent advice except the bed consists of whatever collection of blankets and straw you've assembled on the dirt floor of your hut. And rest is difficult when your intestines are staging hourly rebellions against your general health and well-being. But here's the psychological challenge of dysentery. It's humiliating. You're a continental soldier fighting for American independence, and you're being defeated by your own digestive system. It's like being conquered by an enemy that attacks from within and uses your body's natural functions as weapons against your personal dignity. Every trip to the latrine becomes a reminder that your body has betrayed you in the most basic and embarrassing way possible. The camp's women have once again become the real medical professionals, not through formal training but through practical necessity. They know that dysentery patients need fluids more than food, that certain herbal teas can help with cramping, and that keeping patients clean requires constant attention and significant effort. They've developed systems for caring for multiple dysentery patients simultaneously, while avoiding infection themselves. Your own bout with dysentery follows the standard progression. mild symptoms that could be ignored, moderate symptoms that require attention, and severe symptoms that make you question whether dying might be preferable to living with intestinal rebellion. The cramping becomes so intense that you find yourself negotiating with your own digestive system, promising to eat better food if your intestines will just stop trying to eliminate themselves through violent contractions. The dehydration component of dysentery presents its own special challenges when you're living in conditions where clean water is scarce and contaminated water is abundant. You need fluids to replace what your body is losing, but drinking potentially contaminated water risks making the dysentery worse or introducing new infections to your already stressed system. It's like being thirsty in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by water that might kill you if you drink it. Here's a fringe medical fact that would fascinate gastroenterologists. Many soldiers develop what amounts to chronic dysentery that never completely resolves during their time at Valley Forge. Their digestive systems never fully recover from the initial infection, leaving them with ongoing intestinal problems that affect their ability to absorb nutrition from food that's already inadequate. It's like having a permanent leak in a system that was already running on empty. The social dynamics of dysentery are as challenging as the medical aspects. 12 men sharing a small hut when several of them are experiencing uncontrollable diarrhea creates logistical problems that require diplomatic solutions. Who gets priority access to the chamber pot? How do you maintain any semblance of privacy? How do you keep the hut habitable when multiple people are dealing with intestinal emergencies simultaneously? But somehow you survive your bout with dysentery. Whether through luck, a strong constitution, or the kind of stubborn refusal to die that characterizes Continental soldiers, your intestines eventually decide to rejoin your body's general rebellion against British rule rather than staging their own separate insurrection against your survival. The cramping subsides, the diarrhea becomes manageable, and you begin the slow process of recovering from an illness that's killed hundreds of your fellow soldiers. As evening approaches, you inventory the physical and psychological damage from your encounter with camp dysentery. You've lost weight you couldn't afford to lose, developed a new appreciation for normal digestive function, and gained first-hand knowledge of how disease can be as effective as British bullets at reducing the Continental Army's fighting strength. You've also survived something that's killing people throughout the camp, which makes you either lucky or tougher than you realised. The fire burns low as you settle in for what you hope will be a night of uninterrupted sleep, without the cramping and urgent trips to the latrine that have characterised the past week. Your digestive system seems to have negotiated a temporary truce with your survival instincts, though you're aware that dysentery has a tendency to return when you least expect it. You're still here, still alive, still fighting the daily battle against disease that is proving more deadly than the British Army, and more persistent than winter weather. Your body has survived a rebellion by your own intestines, which somehow seems like appropriate preparation for surviving a revolution saying, the most powerful empire in the world. You're sitting by your hut's fire in late winter, watching another soldier develop the telltale rash that means smallpox has come to visit, when General Washington makes an announcement that sounds like something a particularly creative madman might propose. He's going to deliberately infect the entire Continental Army with smallpox in order to prevent them from dying of smallpox. It's called variolation, and it's the 18th century equivalent of fighting fire with fire, except the fire is a disease that kills roughly 1 in 3 people who contract it naturally, and the solution is to give everyone a milder version of the same disease and hope for the best. It's like responding to a shark attack by deliberately getting bitten by smaller sharks until you build up immunity to being eaten. Here's a fascinating medical fact that would make modern epidemiologists both horrified and impressed. Variolation works, sort of, sometimes, if you survive it. The process involves taking pus from someone with a mild case of smallpox and introducing it into healthy people through small cuts in their skin, creating a controlled infection that's usually less severe than naturally occurring smallpox, but still potentially fatal. The timing of Washington's mass inoculation program is either brilliant or insane, depending on your perspective. The army is already weakened by months of malnutrition, exposure, and various other diseases, which means introducing smallpox to soldiers whose immune systems are already stressed is like adding gasoline to a fire that's already consuming everything in sight. But smallpox has broken out in camp anyway, and doing nothing guarantees that it will kill significantly more people than doing something might kill. Your personal experience with variolation begins with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that would be impressive if it weren't terrifying. Soldiers are organised into groups for systematic inoculation, with careful records kept of who's been treated, when they were treated, and how they're responding to their deliberately induced infections. It's like being processed through a medical assembly line designed by someone who believes that disease can be managed through proper documentation. The actual inoculation procedure is surprisingly simple and completely horrifying. A surgeon makes small cuts in your arm, usually 2 or 3 shallow incisions that barely break the skin, and then introduces material from a smallpox pustule directly into the wounds. It's like getting a vaccination, except instead of a refined vaccine, you're getting actual disease matter from someone who's actively sick with the thing you're trying to prevent. The surgeon performing your inoculation is a competent man who's done this procedure hundreds of times, and has developed the kind of professional detachment that allows him to deliberately infect people while maintaining the demeanour of someone providing helpful medical care. He explains that you'll likely develop a mild case of smallpox, that most people survive variolation, and that the alternative is potentially dying from naturally occurring smallpox, which kills significantly more people than the controlled version. Listen to the sounds of mass inoculation at Valley Forge, the quiet conversations between surgeons and soldiers about the risks and benefits of variolation, the scratching of quill pens as medical personnel record details of each procedure, the nervous laughter of people who are voluntarily signing up to be infected with a disease that might kill them in order to avoid being killed by the same disease in its more dangerous form. But here's where the process becomes genuinely surreal. You're now waiting to get sick. For the next several days, you'll be monitoring your body for signs that the deliberate infection is taking hold, hoping that you develop enough smallpox to create immunity, but not so much that it kills you. It's like playing Russian roulette with diseases, except the stakes are permanent immunity versus death, and the odds are better than Russian roulette, but not by as much as you'd prefer. The initial symptoms of variolation appear within a few days: mild fever, general fatigue, and the beginning of the characteristic rash that starts as small red spots and gradually develops into pustules that would be disgusting under normal circumstances, but which you're now viewing as evidence that the process is working as intended. You're essentially cheering for your own infection, which is a psychological adjustment that requires more flexibility than you realized you possessed. Your hut becomes a controlled smallpox environment where 12 men are simultaneously developing mild cases of a disease that normally spread through communities like wildfire. The irony is not lost on anyone. You're living in conditions that would normally be ideal for spreading disease, but now you want the disease to spread in a controlled manner to everyone at once so that everyone can develop immunity simultaneously. The progression of variolation smallpox is typically less severe than naturally occurring smallpox, but less severe is a relative term when you're dealing with a disease that causes fever, pustules, and the possibility of permanent scarring or death. Your fever reaches levels that make thinking clearly difficult, your skin develops lesions that itch constantly, and you feel weak in a way that's different from the weakness caused by malnutrition. This is the weakness of a body fighting a controlled infection. Women in the camp have become essential to the success of the inoculation program, not just because they provide nursing care, but because many have experience managing smallpox in their families and communities. They know how to recognize dangerous complications, how to provide comfort care during the worst phases of the disease, and how to prevent secondary infections that can turn mild variolation into serious medical emergencies. Here's a historical fact that would fascinate medical researchers. Washington's mass inoculation program at Valley Forge is one of the first large-scale vaccination campaigns in military history. The Continental Army is essentially serving as test subjects for a medical procedure that will eventually contribute to the complete eradication of smallpox worldwide, though that won't happen for another 200 years, and the soldiers undergoing variolation have no idea they're participating in medical history. The psychological impact of successful variolation is almost as important as the medical benefits. Surviving a controlled case of smallpox provides proof that your body can fight off serious diseases, which builds confidence in your immune system's ability to handle other infections. It's like passing a test that demonstrates your personal capacity for surviving challenges that kill other people. Your own case of variolation resolves after about 2 weeks of fever, pustules, and general misery that's significantly more pleasant than dying, but considerably less fun than being healthy. You emerge from the experience with immunity to smallpox, several new scars that will be permanent reminders of your participation in Washington's medical experiment, and a new appreciation for the difference between diseases you choose to have and diseases that choose to have you. As you recover from your deliberately induced smallpox, you realise you've participated in something that's both medically progressive and personally terrifying. You've survived a controlled infection with a disease that kills thousands of people annually, gained immunity that will last for the rest of your life, and contributed to keeping the Continental Army functional despite the best efforts of multiple diseases to eliminate American independence through systematic biological warfare. The fire burns low as you settle in for what you hope will be a full night's sleep without fever or the constant itching that characterise the worst phase of variolation. Your skin is healing, your energy is returning, and you have one less disease to worry about during the remaining winter months at Valley Forge. You're still here, still alive, still fighting the daily battle against diseases that seem determined to accomplish what the British Army hasn't managed to achieve through conventional military means. Your body has survived deliberate infection with smallpox, which makes you either braver or more desperate than you realised, and probably both. You're standing in formation on a February morning that's cold enough to freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth, when a Prussian officer who looks like he was designed by someone with strong opinions about military efficiency arrives to teach you how to be a proper soldier. His name is Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, and he's about to transform you from a barely organised collection of starving farmers Lusons into something resembling a professional army. Steuben speaks limited English, which means his instructions are delivered in a combination of German, French, and creative profanity that transcends language barriers. When words fail him, he gestures emphatically, demonstrates personally, and occasionally swears in languages you didn't know existed. It's like taking military instruction from someone who communicates through interpretive cursing and aggressive mime. Here's a delightful historical fact that'll warm your frozen heart. Steuben isn't actually the Prussian general that Benjamin Franklin claimed he was when recommending him to Congress. He's a former captain who served as an aide to Frederick the Great, which makes him significantly more qualified than most people at Valley Forge, but considerably less impressive than his resume suggested. It's like discovering that your driving instructor isn't actually a professional race car driver, just someone who once rode in a taxi driven by someone who met a race car driver. But here's the thing about Steuben. He knows how armies work. Real armies, professional armies that can march in formation, execute complex maneuvers, and fight battles without dissolving into chaos the moment someone starts shooting. The Continental Army, by contrast, has been operating on the principle that enthusiasm can substitute for training, and that patriotism can replace tactical competence. Your first drill session with Baron von Steuben feels like discovering that everything you thought you knew about being a soldier was wrong. He starts with basic positions, how to stand, how to hold your musket, how to move from one formation to another, without creating the kind of confusion that gets people killed in combat. These seem like simple concepts until you try to execute them while your hands are numb from cold and your brain is foggy from malnutrition. The Baron has brought with him a revolutionary concept: standardized drill. Instead of each regiment learning different procedures from officers with different backgrounds and different ideas about military protocol, everyone will learn the same movements, the same commands, the same responses. It's like switching from a situation where every car has different rules for driving to a system where everyone follows the same traffic laws. Listen to the sounds of Steuben's training sessions, the rhythmic stomping of feet as soldiers practice marching in unison, the Baron's voice calling out commands in his distinctive accent, the occasional crash as someone fails to execute a maneuver properly and collides with their neighbour. It's like listening to a symphony orchestra during their first rehearsal, recognisable potential buried under layers of inexperience and confusion. But here's where Steuben's approach differs from typical European military training. He adapts to American conditions. Instead of expecting colonial soldiers to master the complex drill procedures that work for professional European armies, he simplifies everything to focus on movements that will actually be useful in combat. It's like learning to drive using a manual designed for people who need to know how to operate a car, not how to build one from scratch. Your personal experience with Prussian drill begins with learning to march without looking like a drunk person attempting to navigate through a maze while blindfolded. Steuben's version of marching involves keeping pace with other soldiers, Moving in straight lines and maintaining formation even when the person next to you is also learning to march and occasionally veers off in unexpected directions. The Baron's teaching methodology combines demonstration, repetition, and the kind of patient persistence that suggests he's dealt with challenging students before. When you fail to execute a movement correctly, he doesn't yell or punish, he demonstrates again, more slowly, with additional explanations delivered in his unique combination of languages and gestures. It's like having a tutor who's genuinely interested in your success rather than just interested in showing off their knowledge. But the most revolutionary aspect of Steuben's training is that he teaches officers alongside enlisted men. In European armies, officers learned military procedures through formal education and assumed that enlisted men would simply follow orders without understanding the reasoning behind them. Steuben insists that everyone understand not just what to do, but why they're doing it, which creates a level of tactical sophistication that the Continental Army has never achieved. Here's a fringe military fact that would fascinate modern military historians. Steuben's drill manual, which will eventually be published as the Blue Book, becomes the standard training manual for the American Army and remains in use, with modifications, for decades after the Revolutionary War. You're learning procedures that will influence American military training long after everyone currently freezing at Valley Forge has died of old age or British bullets. The physical demands of drill training add another layer of challenge to your already difficult survival situation. Learning complex movements requires energy that your malnourished body doesn't have, and practicing marching exercises means additional wear on shoes that are already falling apart. It's like signing up for dance lessons while recovering from the flu and wearing shoes made of paper. Your fellow soldiers respond to Steuben's training with a mixture of enthusiasm and exhaustion. Everyone understands that professional military training might keep them alive in future battles, but everyone is also dealing with the immediate challenges of not dying from cold, hunger, and disease. Learning to march in formation seems less urgent than finding something to eat, though both are necessary for the army's survival. Women in the camp observe the training sessions with interest and occasionally participate in learning basic military procedures. Many have been following the army long enough to understand that everyone's survival depends on the soldiers becoming more effective fighters, and some have developed their own informal military knowledge through experience and observation. They provide encouragement, practical assistance, and occasionally helpful criticism when the Baron's instructions aren't being followed correctly. The Baron's training methods extend beyond drill to include basic military hygiene, camp organisation, and procedures for maintaining equipment. He introduces concepts like regular inspection of weapons and gear, systematic approaches to camp sanitation, and protocols for managing supplies. It's like receiving a comprehensive education in military professionalism from someone who understands that armies function best when they operate according to established systems, rather than improvised chaos. As weeks pass, you begin to notice changes in yourself and in the army generally. Movements that initially required conscious thought become automatic responses. Commands that were confusing become familiar signals that trigger practiced reactions. The Continental Army starts to look and move like a professional military force instead of an armed mob with good intentions and inadequate training. By late winter, your unit can execute complex manoeuvres that would have been impossible when Steuben arrived. You can change from column to line formation, perform flanking movements, and coordinate actions with other units in ways that create tactical advantages rather than tactical confusion. It's like upgrading from amateur-level chaos to professional-level competence. The psychological impact of improved military competence is as important as the tactical benefits. Knowing that you and your fellow soldiers can execute complex maneuvers successfully builds confidence in your ability to fight effectively against British regulars who have previously defeated you through superior training and organisation. It's the difference between feeling like victims and feeling like warriors. As spring approaches, you realise that Baron von Steuben has accomplished something remarkable. He's transformed a collection of desperate, starving, poorly organised colonial soldiers into something that's beginning to resemble a real army. You're still desperate, still starving and still poorly supplied, but now you're desperate, starving and poorly supplied soldiers who can march, manoeuvre and fight according to professional military standards. You're practicing bayonet drill on a March morning, When you realise that Baron von Steuben has been teaching you something that goes beyond military procedures, he's been teaching you how to think like professional soldiers rather than armed civilians who happen to be fighting a war, is the difference between knowing how to shoot a musket and understanding how armies work. The Baron's approach to military education is comprehensive in ways that surprise you. Instead of just learning individual skills, you're learning how those skills combine to create tactical advantages. Instead of just following orders, you're learning to understand the reasoning behind orders, which makes you more effective at adapting when situations change and orders don't cover unexpected circumstances. Here's a military fact that would fascinate tactical theorists. Steuben's training program is creating something that hasn't existed before in the Continental Army. Soldiers who can fight as coordinated units rather than as individual fighters who happen to be standing near each other. European armies achieved this coordination through years of peacetime training and rigid social hierarchies. The Continental Army is achieving it through intensive crash courses delivered by a Prussian expert who's working with whatever material he's given. Your bayonet training illustrates the difference between amateur and professional military instruction. Previously, bayonet use was something you learned informally. Stick the pointy end into enemy soldiers while trying not to get stuck yourself. Steuben teaches bayonet fighting as a systematic skill that combines footwork, weapon handling and tactical awareness to create advantages in close combat situations. The Baron demonstrates personally despite being old enough to be someone's grandfather and dignified enough to be someone's ambassador. He shows you how to thrust effectively, how to parry enemy attacks, how to maintain balance while engaging multiple opponents, and how to coordinate bayonet attacks with other soldiers to create tactical superiority. It's like receiving personal instruction from someone who's spent decades studying the science of close-quarters combat. Listen to the sounds of advanced military training, the clash of bayonets as soldiers practice combat techniques, the Baron's voice explaining the physics of effective thrusting angles, the occasional grunt of pain when someone fails to parry correctly, and receives a bruise that will remind them to pay better attention during the next practice session. It's like listening to a workshop where the subject matter is applied violence and the instructor is someone who treats violence as an academic discipline. But here's where Steuben's instruction becomes truly valuable. He teaches you to fight as part of a unit, rather than as an individual. Bayonet combat isn't just about personal skill, it's about coordinating with the soldiers on either side of you to create overlapping fields of attack and defense. European armies excel at this kind of coordinated fighting, which is why they consistently defeat American forces that have superior individual fighting skills but inferior unit coordination. Your musket training under Steuben reveals similar attention to systematic improvement. Instead of just learning to load and fire, you learn to load and fire in coordination with other soldiers to create sustained volleys that maximize the impact of limited ammunition. Instead of just aiming at individual targets, you learn to aim at formations to create maximum casualties with each shot. The Baron's version of musket drill includes timing exercises that seem almost mathematical in their precision. Load in 12 counts, aim on command, fire simultaneously, reload while other soldiers fire, maintain continuous pressure on enemy formations through coordinated volleys. It's like learning to play a musical instrument, where the music is applied violence and the performance venue is a battlefield. Here's a fringe military fact that would interest weapons historians. Steuben adapts European musket procedures to accommodate American conditions and American weapons. European drill assumes standardized equipment and unlimited ammunition. American drill must work with mixed weapons, limited ammunition, and soldiers who bring their own idea about how firearms should be used based on hunting experience and militia training. The psychological transformation that accompanies improved military skills is as important as the tactical improvements. Soldiers who know they can execute complex maneuvers successfully develop confidence in their ability to fight effectively against professional enemies. Confidence affects performance in ways that are difficult to measure but easy to observe. Confident soldiers fight harder, adapt better, and survive more frequently than soldiers who doubt their abilities. Your own development under Steuben's training illustrates the broader changes occurring throughout the Continental Army. Movements that required conscious thought become automatic responses. Commands that were confusing become familiar signals that trigger practiced reactions. You begin to think tactically rather than just reactively, considering how your actions affect the soldiers around you. and how unit actions affect overall military objectives, but the Baron's instruction extends beyond combat techniques to include the kind of military professionalism that distinguishes armies from mobs. He teaches procedures for maintaining equipment, protocols for organising camp life, and systems for managing supplies that maximise efficiency and minimise waste. It's like receiving an education in military administration from someone who understands that armies succeed through organisation as much as through fighting ability. The integration of drill, weapons training and military administration creates something that the Continental Army has never achieved before: systematic competence. Instead of depending on the individual initiative and improvised solutions, the Army is developing institutional knowledge and standard procedures that function regardless of which specific soldiers are involved in executing them. Here's what becomes apparent as spring approaches. The Continental Army is transforming from a revolutionary militia into something approaching a professional military force. You're still undersupplied, still inadequately fed, and still operating under conditions that would challenge modern armies. But you're doing all of this with systematic competence rather than heroic improvisation. Women in the camp contribute to this transformation by learning military procedures that help them support combat operations more effectively. Many become skilled at maintaining weapons, preparing ammunition, and organising supplies according to military protocols. They understand that everyone's survival depends on the army becoming more professional, and they adapt their own activities to support systematically organised military operations. The Baron's influence extends beyond formal training sessions to affect the general culture of the army. Standards of personal appearance improve, not because soldiers have better clothes, but because they understand that military appearance affects military function. Camp organisation becomes more systematic, with designated areas for specific activities and established procedures for managing daily routines. As the winter at Valley Forge nears its end, you realise that you've participated in something historically significant: the transformation of the Continental Army from an armed rabble into a professional military force capable of fighting European-style battles against European-trained opponents. It's the difference between being rebels and being soldiers, between fighting desperately and fighting systematically. The Baron's training has given you something more valuable than individual military skills. It's given you the knowledge that the Continental Army can compete tactically with the best professional armies in the world. This knowledge changes everything about how you approach the war, how you think about future battles, and how you assess the possibility that American independence might actually be achievable through military means. You're copying sections of Baron von Steuben's drill manual by candlelight in your hut, and you realise you're participating in the creation of what will become the official tactical doctrine of the United States Army. The Baron's instructions are being compiled, edited, and prepared for publication as the Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States, which will be known informally as the Blue Book because of its distinctive cover. Writing an official military manual while living in a log hut with 11 other soldiers who are slowly recovering from various diseases presents its own unique challenges. Your quill pen keeps freezing, the ink occasionally develops an icy film that must be warmed before use, and the paper, when you can find it, often becomes damp from the humidity created by 12 people breathing in an enclosed space with inadequate ventilation. Here's a fascinating historical fact that would delight military historians. The Blue Book becomes the standard drill manual for the American Army, and remains in use, with modifications and updates, well into the 19th century. You're copying instructions that will influence American military training for decades after everyone currently at Valley Forge has died of old age, British bullets, or the long-term effects of malnutrition and exposure. The process of creating the manual illustrates the systematic approach that characterises everything Steuben does. Instead of just teaching drill procedures informally, he's documenting every movement, every command, every response, so that future training can be conducted according to standardised procedures. It's like creating an instruction manual for operating an army, written by someone who understands that armies function best when everyone follows the same instructions. Your own role in transcribing the Blue Book gives you insight into the complexity of military organisation that you never appreciated before. Each drill movement must be broken down into component steps. Each step must be explained clearly enough that officers with varying levels of experience can teach it effectively, and each explanation must be detailed enough to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that create chaos during actual combat. The Baron's writing style reflects his practical approach to military instruction. Instead of theoretical discussions about military science, the Blue Book provides specific, step-by-step instructions for executing movements that will keep soldiers alive in combat situations. It's like a cookbook for military survival, written by someone who's spent years perfecting recipes that work under life-and-death conditions. Listen to the sounds of manual creation at Valley Forge, the scratch of quill pens on paper as multiple soldiers transcribe different sections, the Baron's voice explaining procedures to ensure accurate transcription, the quiet discussions among officers about how to phrase instructions clearly enough that they can't be misinterpreted during the stress of the combat. It's like listening to the birth of institutional knowledge. But here's where the Blue Book becomes revolutionary. It assumes that American soldiers can learn complex procedures if they're taught systematically. European military doctrine often assumed that enlisted men were incapable of understanding tactical concepts and should simply follow orders without comprehension. Steuben's manual assumes that soldiers who understand procedures will execute them more effectively than soldiers who simply obey without thinking. The manual's sections on camp administration reflect the Baron's understanding that armies succeed through organisation as much as through fighting ability. Instructions for organising supply lines, maintaining sanitary conditions, and managing daily routines create systems that prevent the kind of administrative chaos that has plagued the Continental Army throughout the war. Your copying work reveals the attention to detail that makes the Blue Book effective. Descriptions of weapons handling specify exact hand positions, timing and coordination requirements. Explanations of formation changes include diagrams that show how individual soldiers should move to create the desired unit configuration. Even basic procedures like standing at attention are described with precision that eliminates guesswork. Here's a fringe historical fact that would fascinate military anthropologists. The Blue Book creates a shared military culture for the Continental Army. Instead of soldiers from different regions following different procedures based on their local militia traditions, everyone learns the same responses to the same commands. It's like creating a common language for an army that previously spoke in tactical dialects. The psychological impact of having written doctrine extends beyond the practical benefits of standardized training. Soldiers who possess official manuals feel like they are part of a professional military organization, rather than an improvised collection of armed civilians. Having written procedures creates institutional legitimacy that affects morale and self-perception in ways that are difficult to measure, but easy to observe. Women in the camp contribute to the manual creation process by providing clerical support, copying sections, and organising materials. Many have better handwriting than the soldiers, and more experience with detailed written work. Some become informal editors, suggesting clarifications and corrections that improve the manual's clarity and usefulness. The Baron's manual addresses uniquely American military conditions that European drill books don't consider. Procedures for fighting in forests, instructions for coordinating with militia forces, and adaptations for armies with limited supplies reflect his understanding that American military doctrine must work under American conditions rather than European conditions. As the manual nears completion as spring approaches, you realise you've participated in creating something that's both practical and historically significant. The Blue Book represents the institutional knowledge of a professional army, documented and preserved for future use. It's the difference between being a temporary military force created for a specific conflict and being the foundation of a permanent military institution. The manual's influence extends beyond the Continental Army to affect how Americans think about military organisation generally. State militias adopt sections of the Blue Book for their own training, creating tactical compatibility between regular and militia forces that improves coordination during joint operations. It's like creating universal standards that work across different levels of military organisation. Your personal experience with transcribing the Blue Book gives you appreciation for the intellectual foundations of militarist professionalism. Effective armies aren't just collections of brave individuals. They're institutions that function according to established procedures that have been tested, refined, and documented for systematic use. The Baron has taught you that military excellence is achievable through systematic training rather than accidental heroism. As candlelight flickers across the pages you're copying, you realise that you're contributing to something that will outlast the current war and influence American military development for generations. The Blue Book represents the transformation of the Continental Army from an improvised revolutionary force into the institutional foundation of the United States Army. The manual contains not just tactical procedures, but the accumulated wisdom of professional military science adapted for American conditions by someone who understands both European military traditions and American military realities. It's like receiving a comprehensive education in militaries, excellence from someone who's spent decades learning what works and what doesn't work when lives depend on tactical competence. You're sitting by your hut's fire in January, sharing a meal that consists primarily of optimism and trace amounts of actual nutrition, when you overhear officers discussing something that sounds like a conspiracy theory but turns out to be actual conspiracy. There's a plot to remove George Washington as Commander-in-Chief and replace him with Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, who apparently thinks he could do a better job of not freezing to death in Pennsylvania. The plot has a name that sounds like it should involve international intrigue and secret meetings in shadowy taverns, the Conway Cabal. It's named after Thomas Conway, an Irish-born French officer who's spent considerable energy criticising Washington's leadership and apparently believes that America's military fortunes would improve if someone else were making the strategic decisions while soldiers slowly starve in winter camps. Here's a delightful political fact that would fascinate students of military coups. The Conway Cabal is attempting to overthrow the Commander-in-Chief while he's managing one of the most challenging military situations in American history. It's like staging a mutiny during a hurricane. Technically possible, but requiring a level of political tone deafness that suggests the conspirators haven't been paying attention to practical realities. But let's explore the fascinating world of Revolutionary War politics, shall we? The Continental Congress, which is supposed to be running the war effort, has developed its own internal conflicts about military strategy, civilian control of the military, and whether George Washington is the right person to lead American forces to victory. These debates might be intellectually interesting if they weren't taking place while soldiers are dying from preventable causes. Your personal experience with military politics is limited to observing its effects on your daily survival chances. When Congress fails to provide adequate supplies, you eat less. When political infighting prevents effective administration, logistics become more chaotic. When civilian authorities question military leadership, it creates uncertainty that affects morale and strategic planning. Politics, it turns out, has very practical consequences when you're living in conditions that test the limits of human endurance. The Conway Cabal represents a collision between idealistic political theory and brutal military reality. The conspirators believe that different leadership would produce better results, but they don't seem to understand that the problems facing the Continental Army aren't primarily leadership problems, they're resource problems, logistics problems, and the problem of fighting the most powerful military in the world with inadequate supplies and insufficient support. Listen to the sounds of political intrigue at Valley Forge, whispered conversations between officers about civilian criticism of Washington, quiet discussions about whether different leadership might improve the army's situation, and the occasional heated argument about whether the current military strategy is sustainable given the resources available. It's like overhearing a coup being planned by people who have never actually planned a coup. Conway himself is an interesting character, a professional soldier with legitimate military experience who's frustrated by what he perceives as American military incompetence. His criticisms of Washington aren't entirely unfair, but his proposed solutions reflect a European perspective that doesn't account for American political and military realities. It's like having a foreign consultant who understands the technical aspects of the job but doesn't understand the organizational culture. But here's where the Cabal becomes truly problematic. It's attempting to change military leadership while the army is in crisis. Replacing Washington during the Valley Forge winter would create exactly the kind of institutional disruption that could cause the complete collapse of the Continental Army. It's like firing the captain of a sinking ship during a storm, even if the captain isn't perfect. Changing leadership during a crisis usually makes the crisis worse rather than better. The broader political context of the Cabal reflects deep tensions within the revolutionary movement about military strategy, civilian authority, and the balance between democratic governance and effective military leadership. Some members of Congress genuinely believe that Washington's leadership is inadequate, and that different command decisions would produce better military results. Your fellow soldiers respond to rumours about the Conway Cabal with a mixture of loyalty to Washington and concern about political instability. Most soldiers have developed personal respect for Washington, based on his willingness to share their hardships and his efforts to secure supplies and support for the army. The idea of replacing him with someone who hasn't demonstrated similar commitment creates anxiety about whether new leadership would be better or worse for their survival chances. Women in the camp often have better information about political developments than enlisted soldiers, because they interact with officers' wives and have access to correspondence and conversations that reveal military politics. Many express strong opinions about the importance of stable leadership during crisis situations, and they understand that political disruption could have direct effects on their own survival and that of their families. Here's a fringe political fact that would fascinate historians of military coups. The Conway Cabal fails partly because it's attempting to orchestrate a leadership change without having a clear plan for dealing with the practical problems that face any commander-in-chief. Gates might be a better battlefield tactician than Washington, but there's no evidence that he would be better at managing Congress, securing supplies, or maintaining army morale during extended hardship. The psychological impact of political instability on army morale is significant but difficult to measure. Soldiers who are already dealing with extreme physical hardship don't need the additional stress of wondering whether their leadership structure is going to change unpredictably. Uncertainty about command authority affects decision-making at every level and creates confusion about long-term strategic planning. Washington's response to the Cabal demonstrates the kind of political skill that his critics often underestimate. Instead of confronting the conspiracy directly, he allows it to expose itself through the normal functioning of military and political processes. Conway and his allies eventually discredit themselves through their own actions, eliminating the threat without creating the kind of dramatic confrontation that could damage army unity. The resolution of the Conway Cabal strengthens Washington's position by demonstrating that alternative leadership options are more theoretical than practical. Officers and soldiers who might have been tempted to support change realise that the current leadership, despite its flaws, is preferable to the uncertainty and disruption that would accompany a leadership change during ongoing crisis. As winter progresses towards spring, the failure of the Conway Cabal removes one source of instability from an already challenging situation. The Continental Army can focus on survival, training, and preparation for future campaigns without the distraction of internal political conflicts that threaten to undermine command authority at the worst possible time. The political lessons of the Cabal extend beyond military affairs to illuminate broader questions about democratic governance during wartime. How much civilian oversight of military affairs is appropriate during crisis situations? How should democratic societies balance accountability with the need for effective leadership during emergencies? These questions will continue to challenge American political development long after the Revolutionary War ends. You're trying to repair your shoes with strips of leather salvaged from a dead horse, when news arrives that the Continental Congress has passed another resolution expressing support for the army and promising that adequate supplies will be provided soon. The disconnect between congressional promises and your current reality, which includes the fact that you're literally trying to cobble together footwear from roadkill, illustrates the fundamental problem of trying to fight a war with a government that exists primarily in theory. Here's a cheerful political fact that'll warm your frozen heart. The Continental Congress has essentially stopped functioning as an effective government while continuing to operate as an extremely effective producer of resolutions, proclamations, and promises that have no relationship to actual resources or practical capabilities. It's like having a board of directors that excels at writing mission statements while the company slowly goes bankrupt. The problem isn't that Congress lacks good intentions. Most delegates genuinely want to support the army and win the war. The problem is that good intentions can't be eaten, worn, or used as ammunition, and the Continental Congress has developed a remarkable ability to confuse expressing concern with taking effective action. They were like parents who constantly tell their children how much they love them while forgetting to provide food, clothing, or shelter. Your personal experience with congressional governance consists primarily of observing its absence. Supplies that Congress promises to send don't arrive. Pay that Congress authorizes isn't distributed. Equipment that Congress requisitions doesn't exist. The gap between congressional promises and army realities has become so wide that congressional resolutions are treated as interesting fiction rather than actual policy. But let's explore the fascinating world of Revolutionary War governmental dysfunction, shall we? Congress faces the challenge of trying to run a war without having effective taxation authority, reliable revenue sources, or the administrative infrastructure necessary for managing complex military operations. They're attempting to operate a government with powers that wouldn't be adequate for running a moderately successful small business. The delegates who comprise Congress are generally intelligent, well-intentioned men who are encountering problems that are beyond their experience and possibly beyond their capabilities. Many have backgrounds in law, business, or local politics, but none have experience managing military logistics for armies operating under extreme conditions. It's like asking successful restaurateurs to design and build spacecraft. The skills are related but not directly transferable. Listen to the sounds of congressional ineffectiveness as they reach Valley Forge. The arrival of messengers carrying resolutions that promise supplies that don't exist. The discussions among officers about how to implement congressional directives that can't be implemented with available resources. The occasional bitter laughter when someone reads aloud the latest congressional promise of support that everyone knows won't be fulfilled. The financial situation illustrates the core problem with congressional governance. Continental currency has become so worthless that it's literally used as kindling, which means Congress can't purchase supplies even when supplies are available for purchase. The government is trying to fund a war with money that has no value, which is like trying to pay for groceries with monopoly money and expecting merchants to accept it because it represents the full faith and credit of a government that doesn't have credit. Here's where the situation becomes truly surreal. Congress continues to pass budgets and authorize expenditures as if the government had functional revenue sources and effective administrative systems. It's like a family that's broke but continues to write checks based on the assumption that money will appear in their account through some unspecified financial miracle. Your fellow soldiers respond to congressional governance with a mixture of cynicism and grudging loyalty. Everyone understands that Congress is ineffective, but everyone also understands that Congress is the closest thing to legitimate government that exists. It's like being employed by a company that's obviously going bankrupt but hoping they'll figure out how to pay your salary before they collapse completely. The administrative chaos created by congressional mismanagement affects every aspect of Army operations. Commissary officers receive authorization to purchase supplies but no money to make purchases. Quartermaster personnel are assigned to organize logistics operations but given no resources to organize. Medical officers are expected to treat sick soldiers but provided with no medical supplies. It's like being assigned to perform surgery using only optimism and good intentions. But here's the most frustrating aspect of congressional governance. The delegates often seem unaware of the practical effects of their political decisions. They debate theoretical questions about military strategy while soldiers starve. They discuss constitutional principles while the army slowly dissolves through desertion and death. They engage in abstract political theory while practical military operations collapse from lack of support. The communication gap between Congress and the army contributes to governmental dysfunction. Congressional delegates receive reports about military conditions, but reports are filtered through political and administrative layers that obscure the severity of practical problems. Congress often makes decisions based on information that's weeks old and politically sanitized rather than current and complete. Women in the camp often express particularly sharp criticism of congressional ineffectiveness because they see its practical effects on family survival. They understand that governmental failure means children don't get adequate food, that medical care isn't available when needed, and that basic survival becomes more difficult when institutional support systems don't function. Their perspective focuses on practical consequences, rather than political theory. Here's a fringe political fact that would fascinate students of governmental failure. The Continental Congress's inability to support the army effectively contributes to the development of American skepticism about federal government competence that persists long after the Revolutionary War. The experience of watching government promise support while providing failure creates cultural attitudes about the reliability of political institutions. The psychological impact of governmental abandonment on army morale is significant and cumulative. Soldiers who initially believed that their sacrifice would be supported by effective government gradually realize that they're essentially fighting as volunteers for a cause that exists primarily as an aspiration rather than as an institutional reality. It's like joining a team only to discover that the team doesn't actually have coaches, equipment, or a playing field. Washington's relationship with Congress illustrates the challenge of trying to maintain military operations while depending on political institutions that can't provide necessary support. His correspondence with congressional delegates reveals growing frustration with the gap between political promises and military needs, though he maintains public respect for civilian authority, even when that authority proves ineffective. As winter progresses towards spring, the pattern of congressional ineffectiveness becomes so predictable that army planning routinely assumes that promised support won't materialize. Supply operations are organized on the assumption that official procurement will fail. Strategic planning assumes that authorized resources won't be available. It's like living in a world where the weather forecast always predicts sunshine while you're constantly getting rained on. The long-term consequences of congressional failure during the Valley Forge winter extend beyond immediate military effects to influence American political development. The experience of trying to fight a war with inadequate governmental support shapes attitudes about federal authority, military administration, and the relationship between political institutions and practical governance that affect American politics for generations. You're sitting in your hut calculating how much money the Continental Congress owes you in back pay, and you realize that even if they paid you everything they've promised, you still couldn't afford to buy a decent meal because Continental currency is worth slightly less than the paper it's printed on and considerably less than the ink used to print it. The mathematics of revolutionary finance are simple and depressing. You haven't been paid in 3 months. The money you were previously paid is now worthless, and the government that employs you is essentially bankrupt, but continues to make financial promises that everyone knows can't be kept. It's like working for a company that pays you in company stock while the company is obviously going out of business. Here's a delightful economic fact that would make financial historians weep. Continental currency has depreciated so severely that the phrase "not worth a continental" has entered common usage as a way to describe things that have no value whatsoever. You're being paid in currency that's become a metaphor for worthlessness, which seems somehow appropriate for a war that's being funded through governmental wishful thinking. But let's explore the fascinating world of Revolutionary War economics, shall we? The Continental Congress doesn't have taxation authority that would allow it to raise revenue through normal governmental means. Instead, it funds the war by printing money and hoping that confidence in eventual American victory will maintain the currency's value. This strategy works about as well as you'd expect from a plan that depends on hope and confidence rather than actual assets. Your personal financial situation reflects the broader economic collapse that's undermining the war effort. You're owed approximately 6 months' pay, but 6 months' pay in continental currency would buy perhaps 1 week's worth of food at current prices, assuming you could find merchants willing to accept continental currency, which you generally can't. It's like being owed a fortune in a currency that's worth nothing. The inflation affecting continental currency operates according to principles that seem designed to punish people who work for the government while rewarding people who avoid governmental financial obligations. Farmers who sell crops to the British receive hard currency that maintains its value. Soldiers who fight for American independence receive promises to pay them later in money that becomes less valuable every day. Listen to the sounds of economic desperation at Valley Forge. Soldiers discussing how to convert worthless pay vouchers into something that might purchase necessities. Merchants refusing to accept continental currency except at exchange rates that make purchases pointless, and the bitter laughter that accompanies discussions about financial planning when your income consists entirely of governmental IOUs. Officers face their own unique financial challenges because their responsibilities require personal expenditures that their worthless salaries can't cover. Many are going into personal debt to purchase supplies for their soldiers, using their own credit and family resources to provide equipment that the government can't afford. It's like being a teacher who has to buy school supplies for students because the school district doesn't have money. But here's where the financial situation becomes truly problematic. Soldiers who aren't paid have legitimate reasons to desert, but desertion creates military problems that undermine the war effort that depends on their service. The army needs soldiers to fight, but soldiers need payment to survive, and the government can't provide payment, which creates a downward spiral that threatens the entire revolutionary project. The psychological impact of financial abandonment affects morale in ways that are difficult to measure, but easy to observe. Soldiers who believe they're fighting for a cause that will support them develop different attitudes than soldiers who realize they're fighting for a cause that can't afford to pay them. It's the difference between feeling valued and feeling exploited, between believing in institutional commitment and recognizing institutional failure. Your fellow soldiers respond to the financial situation with creative approaches to survival that bypass normal economic systems. Barter becomes more important than currency, with soldiers trading services, goods and labour directly without involving money. Personal relationships become economic networks, with informal credit systems based on trust and mutual obligation rather than financial assets. Women in the camp often manage the practical aspects of economic survival because they're skilled at stretching resources and finding alternatives to normal commercial relationships. They organise sharing networks, manage barter relationships, and provide services that generate income when official payment systems fail. Many become entrepreneurs by necessity, creating value through activities that don't depend on governmental financial support. The broader economic impact of currency collapse extends beyond the army to affect civilian support for the war. Merchants who accept continental currency lose money, which makes them less willing to provide supplies to the army. Farmers who sell crops to the government receive worthless payment, which encourages them to sell to the British instead. Economic failure undermines military operations through its effects on civilian cooperation. Here's a fringe economic fact that would fascinate monetary historians. The financial crisis at Valley Forge contributes to American skepticism about paper currency that influences monetary policy for decades after the Revolutionary War. The experience of watching government-issued money become worthless creates cultural preferences for hard currency and suspicion of governmental financial management. The long-term consequences of the payment crisis extend beyond immediate military effects to influence post-war relationships between veterans and government. Soldiers who serve without adequate payment develop expectations about governmental obligations that affect political development after independence is achieved. The promise of eventual compensation becomes a political issue that influences American politics for years after the war ends. Washington's attempts to address the financial crisis illustrate the limitations of military leadership when political and economic systems fail. He can encourage soldiers to remain loyal despite not being paid, but he can't create money or force Congress to develop effective revenue sources. Military leadership can compensate for some types of institutional failure, but it can't replace functioning economic systems. As spring approaches, the financial situation remains unresolved, but somehow becomes less immediately threatening. The army has developed informal economic systems that function despite the collapse of official payment, and soldiers have adjusted their expectations to reflect the reality that governmental promises about money can't be trusted. It's like learning to survive in an economy that operates according to different rules than the official economy. The experience of fighting a war without being paid teaches lessons about the relationship between economic systems and military effectiveness that influence American military policy long after the Revolutionary War ends. Armies that aren't paid tend to dissolve, but armies that develop alternative economic systems can sometimes survive even when official financial support fails. You're still here, still fighting for independence despite not being paid for fighting for independence. Still part of an army that functions despite economic abandonment by the government it serves? Your personal financial situation is desperate, but your participation in the larger cause continues based on commitments that transcend economic calculation. You wake up on a morning in early March when the temperature has climbed above freezing for the first time in what feels like several geological ages, and you realise that winter is finally beginning to loosen its death grip on Valley Forge. The sound of dripping water from melting ice creates a symphony that's more beautiful than any music you've ever heard, because it's the sound of not dying from hypothermia for at least one more day. But here's the thing about spring at Valley Forge. It doesn't arrive like a gentle awakening or a romantic renewal of life. It arrives like a muddy, disease-ridden swamp that smells like 6 months of accumulated human waste and dead animals thawing in the Pennsylvania sun. It's not so much spring as it is winter with slightly better drainage and significantly worse odours. The Great Thaw reveals the full scope of Valley Forge's winter carnage in ways that snow previously concealed. Bodies of soldiers who died during the worst parts of winter emerge from snowdrifts like grim archaeological discoveries. Animal carcasses that provided temporary sustenance during desperate times begin to decompose in the warming air, creating smells that would challenge the strongest constitutions and the most determined optimists. Here's a cheerful historical fact that'll brighten your entire spring. The thaw creates perfect conditions for the disease outbreaks because warming temperatures, standing water, and accumulated organic waste combine to form what modern epidemiologists would recognise as ideal breeding grounds for every pathogen known to colonial medicine, plus several that haven't been discovered yet. Your personal spring awakening begins with the discovery that your hut, which provided marginal protection during winter, now leaks in places you didn't know existed and allows access to insects, rodents, and smells that somehow managed to get worse as temperatures rose. It's like living in a seasonal depression experiment designed by someone with a particularly cruel sense of humour and a PhD in making people miserable. The mud at Valley Forge deserves its own historical recognition as one of the most persistent and demoralising enemies the Continental Army faced during the entire war. It's not just regular mud, it's mud that's been enriched by 6 months of human and animal waste, dead organic matter, and the accumulated despair of 12,000 people trying to survive under impossible conditions. Walking through it requires the kind of determination usually reserved for religious pilgrimages and extreme sporting events. Listen to the sounds of Valley Forge in spring, the constant squelch of feet moving through mud that has the consistency of malevolent pudding, the crack of ice breaking up on streams that have been frozen solid for months, the increased frequency of coughing as warming temperatures release spores and bacteria that had been dormant during the coldest parts of winter. It's like nature's own horror soundtrack. But here's where the spring thaw reveals the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Soldiers who survive Valley Forge winter begin to show signs of recovery that seem almost miraculous after months of systematic deterioration. Bodies that had been slowly consuming themselves for fuel begin to rebuild muscle mass as food supplies improve. Minds that had been focused entirely on survival begin to consider possibilities beyond mere existence. The improvement in food supplies that accompanies spring results partly from better weather enabling more effective foraging and supply operations, but mostly from the Army's development of procurement systems that function despite congressional neglect. Green and Wadsworth have learned to work within the constraints of governmental dysfunction to create logistics networks that actually deliver supplies to soldiers who need them. Your own physical recovery from the Valley Forge winter illustrates the remarkable capacity of human bodies to regenerate even after prolonged abuse. Weight that you lost during the worst parts of winter slowly returns as nutrition becomes more reliable. Energy that had been entirely devoted to basic survival becomes available again for activities that aren't directly related to not dying immediately. The psychological recovery that accompanies physical improvement affects army morale in ways that are difficult to measure but easy to observe. Soldiers who had been focused entirely on daily survival begin to think about future campaigns, strategic objectives, and the possibility that the war might actually be winnable. It's like watching people remember that they're part of something larger than their individual struggle against environmental hostility. Women in the camp play crucial roles in managing the transition from winter survival to spring preparation for renewed military operations. Many have developed expertise in managing resources under extreme conditions, organising care for sick and recovering soldiers, and maintaining the social networks that kept the army community functional during the worst parts of winter. Their skills become even more valuable as the army prepares to resume active campaigning. Here's a fringe historical fact that would fascinate medical researchers. The survival rate among Valley Forge soldiers is actually higher than might be expected, given the severity of conditions they endured. Modern estimates suggest that approximately 2,000 soldiers died during the encampment, which represents a mortality rate of roughly 16 to 17%. It's catastrophic by modern standards, but remarkable considering the combination of malnutrition, exposure, disease, and inadequate medical care that characterized the winter. The spring renewal at Valley Forge coincides with news of the French alliance, which transforms the psychological atmosphere of the encampment from desperate endurance to cautious optimism. Soldiers who had been fighting what seemed like an impossible war against the world's most powerful empire suddenly realize they're part of an international coalition that includes the world's second most powerful empire. It's like discovering that your David versus Goliath struggle has been upgraded to a more balanced conflict with better odds of success. Training under Baron von Steuben continues and intensifies as spring weather makes extended drill sessions possible. Soldiers who had been learning military procedures in brief sessions between survival activities can now dedicate longer periods to systematic military education. The Continental Army emerges from winter not just as survivors, but as something approaching a professional military force. The organisational improvements that develop during winter continue to evolve as spring enables more complex military activities. Supply systems become more efficient, communication networks improve, and administrative procedures become more systematic. The army that enters spring 1778 is institutionally more competent than the army that entered winter 1777, despite having fewer soldiers and having endured months of systematic hardship. As March progresses toward April, you realise that you've participated in something historically significant: the transformation of a desperate collection of starving, freezing soldiers into something that resembles a functional army. The process involved more suffering than anyone anticipated when it began, but it produced results that no one expected when survival seemed doubtful. The spring cleaning that follows the Great Thaw reveals the full scope of what was required to survive Valley Forge winter. Clothing that seemed adequate in December must be completely replaced. Equipment that functioned during winter requires extensive repair or replacement. Personal belongings that survive the winter often bear permanent scars from months of extreme use under impossible conditions. But you're still here, still breathing, still capable of thinking about the future, rather than just surviving the present. You've emerged from what historians will remember as one of the great tests of human endurance in American history, and you've emerged not just as a survivor, but as a more competent soldier, a more experienced person, and a contributor to the creation of a professional army that can compete with the best military forces in the world. You're practicing drill formations on a muddy April morning when an officer rides into camp with news that changes everything. France has officially recognised American independence and formed a military alliance with the United States. This means you're no longer fighting the British Empire as a collection of rebellious colonists. You're now part of an international coalition that includes the world's second most powerful navy, and a country that has spent centuries perfecting the art of being England's most persistent enemy. The news arrives with the kind of celebration that only people who've spent 6 months slowly starving to death can properly appreciate. General Washington declares a day of thanksgiving with parades, artillery salutes, and, most importantly from your perspective, an extra ration of rum for every soldier. It's like Christmas, the 4th of July, and your birthday combined, except better, because it involves actual alcohol and the possibility that you might not die fighting impossible odds against unlimited British resources. Here's a delightful strategic fact that'll warm your patriotic heart. The French alliance fundamentally changes the mathematics of the Revolutionary War. Instead of 13 colonial assemblies fighting the British Empire with whatever resources they can scrape together, you're now part of a global conflict in which Britain must defend interests in Europe, the Caribbean, India and North America simultaneously. It's like upgrading from playing chess against a grandmaster to playing chess against a grandmaster who's being attacked by 3 other grandmasters at the same time. But let's explore the fascinating world of 18th century international politics, shall we? France isn't joining this alliance because they believe deeply in American independence or democratic principles. They're joining because they want revenge for their humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War, and they see American independence as a way to weaken their traditional enemy. It's realpolitik dressed up as international cooperation, but from your perspective, French motives matter less than French resources. Your personal experience with the French alliance begins with the immediate practical benefits of having allies who possess functional currency, professional military expertise, and supply networks that can actually deliver goods to armies in the field. French money can purchase supplies that continental currency can't buy. French military advisors bring professional knowledge that complements Baron von Steuben's training. French naval power threatens British supply lines in ways that the Continental Navy never could. The psychological impact of the French alliance on army morale is immediate and transformative. Soldiers who had been fighting what seemed like an impossible war suddenly realise they're part of a conflict that has realistic chances of success. It's the difference between feeling abandoned by the world and feeling supported by a major power, between fighting hopelessly and fighting strategically. Listen to the sounds of celebration at Valley Forge, artillery salutes that continue for hours as different units fire ceremonial volleys, cheering soldiers who finally have reasons for optimism, and the rare sound of genuinely happy laughter from people who've forgotten what happiness sounds like. It's like listening to an army remember that winning is actually possible. The Alliance celebration includes a formal parade that showcases the dramatic transformation the Continental Army has undergone during the Valley Forge winter. Soldiers who 6 months ago looked like armed refugees now march in formation with the precision of professional troops. Units that previously moved like confused mobs now execute complex maneuvers with systematic competence. It's like watching a dress rehearsal for victory. But here's where the French alliance becomes truly revolutionary. It provides the Continental Army with access to European military technology, supplies and expertise that American manufacturing can't produce and American resources can't purchase. French weapons are standardized, reliable, and designed for professional military use. French uniforms are actually uniforms rather than collections of random clothing that vaguely resemble military attire. Your own equipment begins to improve as French supplies reach the army through supply networks that function according to professional logistic principles, rather than governmental wishful thinking. Your musket, which had been held together through creative repair work and stubborn determination, is replaced by a French weapon that's designed for military use, and manufactured according to specifications that prioritize effectiveness over cost savings. The arrival of French military advisors supplements Baron von Steuben's training program with additional expertise in artillery, engineering, and specialized military techniques that European armies have developed through centuries of professional warfare. It's like receiving advanced education from instructors who have spent their entire careers mastering subjects that American officers are learning through trial and error. Women in the camp benefit from the French alliance through improved access to supplies, medical resources, and the kind of organizational support that functional allies can provide to military operations. French supply networks include provisions for camp followers and military families that American logistics systems never adequately addressed. It's the difference between being forgotten by your own government and being supported by allies who understand that armies function as communities rather than just collections of individual soldiers. Here's a fringe diplomatic fact that would fascinate international relations theorists. The French alliance represents the first major diplomatic success of American foreign policy and establishes precedents for international cooperation that influence American strategic thinking for generations. The experience of fighting as part of an international coalition creates institutional knowledge about alliance management that affects American military planning long after the Revolutionary War ends. The strategic implications of the French alliance extend beyond immediate military benefits to reshape British strategic planning in ways that benefit American interests. British forces that might have been concentrated against American targets must now be distributed to defend British interests that are threatened by French naval and military power. It's like forcing your opponent to fight on multiple fronts while you concentrate your efforts on achieving specific objectives. The intelligence benefits of having French allies become apparent as reports about British strategic planning reach American commanders through French diplomatic and military networks. Information about British troop movements, supply shortages, and strategic priorities enables more effective American military planning and creates opportunities for coordinated operations that might not have been possible without Allied cooperation. As spring progresses towards summer, the practical effects of the French alliance become increasingly apparent in daily army life. Food supplies become more reliable as French purchasing power secures provisions that American procurement agents couldn't obtain. Equipment becomes more standardized as French manufacturers supply weapons and materials designed for professional military use. Training becomes more sophisticated as French expertise supplements American learning. The long-term consequences of the French alliance extend beyond the Revolutionary War to influence American strategic thinking about international relations, military cooperation, and the balance between independence and alliance obligations. The experience of fighting successfully as part of an international coalition creates precedents and expectations that affect American foreign policy development for decades. But most importantly, from your immediate perspective, the French alliance means you're no longer fighting alone against impossible odds. You're part of something larger, something that has realistic chances of success, something that might actually result in American independence rather than just American martyrdom. It's the difference between dying heroically for a lost cause and living successfully for an achievable objective. You're standing in formation for what will be your final parade at Valley Forge, and you realize that the army preparing to march out of this valley bears almost no resemblance to the collection of desperate, starving, poorly organized soldiers who stumbled into these hills 6 months ago. It's like comparing the first day of boot camp to graduation. The same people, but transformed by experiences that tested every aspect of human endurance and military competence. The most obvious change is that you're still alive. which is a more significant achievement than it might seem to people who haven't spent 6 months watching winter try to kill an entire army through systematic application of cold, hunger, and disease. Roughly 2,000 soldiers didn't survive the Valley Forge winter, but 10,000 did, and those survivors have been forged into something approaching a professional military force through shared suffering and systematic training. Here's a remarkable military fact that would fascinate historians of institutional development. The Continental Army that emerges from Valley Forge is tactically competent in ways that the army that entered Valley Forge never was. 6 months of intensive training under Baron von Steuben has created standardized procedures, coordinated unit movements, and systematic approaches to combat that enable American forces to compete directly with European professional armies. But the transformation extends beyond military skills to include institutional knowledge, systematic organization, and the kind of professional competence that distinguishes armies from armed mobs. The Continental Army now has established procedures for everything from camp organization to supply management to medical care. It's the difference between improvising solutions to problems and implementing tested systems that have been refined through experience. Your personal transformation over the course of the Valley Forge winter illustrates the broader changes that have affected the entire army. You entered winter as someone who knew how to shoot a musket and follow basic orders. You're leaving as someone who understands how armies function, how tactical movements create strategic advantages, and how individual actions contribute to unit effectiveness. It's like upgrading from amateur professional status through intensive practical education. The physical changes in the army are as dramatic as the tactical improvements. Soldiers who survived the winter have developed the kind of physical toughness that comes from enduring conditions that would challenge modern survival experts. Bodies that were soft from civilian life have been hardened by months of physical labour under extreme conditions. It's like completing an endurance training program designed by someone who believes that anything that doesn't kill you makes you significantly stronger. Listen to the sounds of the army preparing to leave Valley Forge. The precise rhythm of coordinated marching as units practice formations they've mastered through months of training, the efficient communication between officers and enlisted men who've learned to function as integrated teams, and the confident conversations of soldiers who've survived challenges that tested their limits and discovered they're capable of more than they realized. The organizational improvements that developed during the winter create systems that enable the army to function effectively even under challenging conditions. Supply procedures that were developed to deal with chronic shortages now enable efficient resource management when supplies are adequate. Communication networks that were tested by crisis situations now provide reliable information flow during normal operations. It's institutional learning through extreme circumstances. But here's where the Valley Forge transformation becomes truly significant. The army has developed collective confidence based on shared experience of surviving the impossible. Soldiers who endured Valley Forge winter together know they can endure other challenges together. Units that maintained cohesion during the worst parts of winter have proven their ability to function under any conditions they are likely to encounter in future campaigns. The psychological transformation that accompanies improved military competence affects how soldiers think about themselves, their capabilities, and their prospects for success in future battles. Instead of feeling like colonial amateurs fighting professional European soldiers, they feel like professional soldiers who happen to be American. It's the difference between hoping to survive encounters with British forces and expecting to compete effectively against British forces. Women who survived the Valley Forge winter have also been transformed by the experience. Many have developed specialised skills in managing resources under extreme conditions, providing medical care with limited supplies, and maintaining community cohesion during extended crisis situations. They've become essential components of army operations, rather than auxiliary personnel who happen to be present. The cultural impact of the Valley Forge experience creates shared identity among survivors that transcends regional, social, and economic differences that previously divided American forces. Soldiers from different colonies who endured the winter together have developed mutual respect based on shared hardship and proven reliability under extreme conditions. It's like creating a new form of American identity through systematic suffering and collective survival. Here's a fringe sociological fact that would fascinate anthropologists. The Valley Forge winter creates cultural bonds among survivors that influence American social development for generations. Veterans of Valley Forge maintain connections and mutual obligations that affect post-war politics, business relationships, and community organization in ways that extend far beyond military affairs. The institutional knowledge that is developed during the Valley Forge winter becomes part of the permanent foundation of American military culture. Procedures that were developed to solve immediate problems become standard practices that influence military organization for decades. Systems that enabled survival under impossible conditions become models for military administration under normal conditions. The contrast between the army that entered Valley Forge and the army that's preparing to leave illustrates what can be accomplished when desperate necessity combines with systematic training and shared commitment to survival. Soldiers who might have been defeated by the challenges they faced instead were strengthened by overcoming those challenges through mutual support and stubborn determination. As you prepare for the march out of Valley Forge, you inventory the changes in yourself and in the army that has become your primary community. You're harder, more competent, and more confident than when you arrived. You understand how armies work, how survival depends on systematic cooperation, and how individual excellence contributes to collective success. You've been transformed from someone who joined the army into someone who has become a soldier in the deepest sense of the word. The army marching out of Valley Forge carries with it the institutional memory of having survived one of the great tests of human endurance in American military history. The experience has created not just better soldiers, but better systems, not just improved tactics, but improved culture, not just professional competence, but professional identity that will influence American military development long after the Revolutionary War ends. But most importantly, you're leaving Valley Forge as part of something that works. The Continental Army has become a functional military organization capable of competing with the best armies in the world. It's no longer a desperate collection of colonial rebels fighting impossible odds. It's a professional military force with realistic chances of achieving victory in a war that now seems winnable rather than just noble. You survived Valley Forge. More than that, you were forged by Valley Forge into something stronger, more capable, and more confident than you were when the experience began. The army that walks out of this valley is ready to win a war, and you're part of making that victory possible. You're taking one last look at Valley Forge as the Continental Army marches east toward new campaigns, and you realize that you've survived something that will be remembered as long as Americans tell stories about what their ancestors endured to create this country. But more than that, you've learned lessons about survival, resilience, and the human capacity for endurance that will serve you well in whatever challenges life presents after the war ends. The most important lesson of Valley Forge is that survival often depends less on resources than on systems. The army that entered winter with inadequate supplies learned to create functional systems for managing scarcity. Soldiers who lacked proper clothing learned to share resources effectively. Units that had no experience working together learned to coordinate activities that kept everyone alive. It's like discovering that organization can substitute for abundance when organization is done systematically and with commitment to collective survival. Here's a final historical fact that puts everything in perspective. The Continental Army that emerges from Valley Forge will go on to fight the British to a standstill at the Battle of Monmouth, demonstrate tactical competence that European observers will find impressive, and eventually contribute to winning a war that seemed impossible when it began 6 months earlier in a frozen valley in Pennsylvania. But the deeper significance of the Valley Forge experience extends beyond military history to illuminate truths about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between individual sacrifice and collective achievement. Thousands of people chose to endure conditions that challenged the limits of survival rather than abandon a cause they believed in. They created functional communities under circumstances that would have destroyed less committed groups. They proved that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they're unified by shared purpose and mutual commitment. Your personal survival of Valley Forge represents participation in something larger than your individual experience. You are part of creating the institutional foundation of the United States Army, contributing to the diplomatic success that secured international recognition of American independence and demonstrating that colonial Americans could compete militarily with the most professional armies in the world. It's like discovering that your individual struggle was actually part of a collective achievement that will influence history for generations. The lessons learned at Valley Forge about leadership, organization, and the management of resources under extreme conditions become part of American institutional knowledge that influences everything from military organization to business management to community response to natural disasters. The experience of creating functional systems under impossible conditions provides models for dealing with other situations where normal resources are inadequate and creative solutions are required. The social bonds created by shared survival at Valley Forge influence American cultural development in ways that extend far beyond military affairs. Veterans of Valley Forge maintain networks of mutual obligation and support that affect post-war economic development, political organization, and community building. The experience of depending on each other for survival creates lasting relationships that contribute to the social fabric of the new nation. But perhaps most importantly, Valley Forge proves that the American experiment in self-governance is supported by people who are willing to sacrifice for principles that transcend their immediate self-interest. The survival of the Continental Army during the Valley Forge winter demonstrates that American independence isn't just a political theory. It's a cause that inspires commitment strong enough to sustain people through experiences that test the limits of human endurance. As you march away from Valley Forge, you carry with you the quiet strength born of shared hardship, and with that strength, drift now into a restful night, knowing that endurance is in your blood.